Long before the name Romania appeared on any map, a powerful kingdom rose in the mountains north of the Danube. Its people called themselves Dacians. To their neighbors, they were fierce, organized, and wealthy enough to attract the full attention of the Roman Empire at its peak. Few ancient societies challenged Rome as effectively, or disappeared as completely. Who were the Dacians, and how did an empire that once rivaled Rome itself vanish into the soil of history? This is the entire story of the Dacian Empire. To understand the later Dacian kingdom, we begin north of the lower Danube, where river, mountain, and steppe met to shape a durable frontier culture. In the centuries from the 7th to the 4th centuries BCE, communities connected to the wider Thracian world settled across the plains and foothills that circle the Carpathians. Greeks sailing along the western shores of the Black Sea founded trading towns, Histria, Tomis, and Calatis, linking inland peoples to Mediterranean exchange. This landscape of river corridors and high ridges favored small fortified settlements, mobile herding, and regional trade. Over time, it also encouraged the rise of leaders who could coordinate defense and manage access to foreign goods. These were the roots of the people's classical authors later called the Geti, and, further west and inland, the Dacians. The broader Thracian cultural zone stretched from the Aegean to the Danube, but local conditions north of the river produced a distinct blend. The lower Danube served as both barrier and highway. It limited direct incursions from the south, while channeling traffic through fordable zones and tributaries. The Carpathians offered timber, ores, and defensible high ground. Between them lay fertile plains and low hills, suitable for cereals and pastoralism. Such variety encouraged communities to specialize and trade with each other. When Greek merchants arrived, bringing fine pottery, wine, metalware, and new ideas about coinage and writing, the local economy gained a second wind. Graves from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE reveal imported amphorae and pottery alongside local crafts, clear signs that inland elites converted surplus grain, livestock, and metal into prestige goods that affirmed their rank. Archaeology suggests a gradual shift from scattered hamlets to larger hilltop settlements defended by ditches, earthen banks, and timber palisades. These sites anchored zones of influence, collecting agricultural produce and controlling paths through the hills. A fortified residence signaled authority, a market day stitched the countryside together. As ironworking spread, this authority became more than symbolic. Iron plowshares improved yields, while iron spearheads and swords altered the scale of warfare. Communities with access to ore veins or skilled smiths could equip larger warbands and protect caravans. In this setting, the leader as warrior and judge gained legitimacy, and the role of ritual specialists grew in step with political consolidation. Classical authors add texture to this picture. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Geti as the bravest and most just of the Thracians, a phrase that combines stereotype and respect. He also reports their belief in a form of immortality tied to a figure named Zalmoxis. According to his account, the Getae periodically sent a messenger to this divine or semi-divine being, believing that the chosen envoy would live forever. While details remain debated, the story hints at a religious system that promised stability and morality in the face of danger. A creed that assured life beyond death may have reinforced social discipline, just as shared rituals bound hilltop communities together under a common moral horizon. Religion and power intersected in more practical ways as well. Sacred sites on prominent hills embodied ancestral claims to territory and legitimacy. Ritual feasting distributed wealth, converted rank into loyalty, and turned imported wine into an instrument of diplomacy. Greek traders did not only sell goods, they also brought stories, techniques, and weights and measures. Seals and stamped amphora handles point to increasingly formalized exchange. Once standards travel, contracts become enforceable, and rulers who guarantee fair dealing gain prestige. In short, commerce helped produce law, and law supported the rise of more centralized leadership. The military dimension of this transformation is equally important. The region's warfare was shaped by terrain. On the plains and in the river valleys, horsemen scouted and raided. In the foothills, infantry defended passes and fortified enclosures. A hallmark of later Dacian warfare, the curved blade known as the falx, has earlier relatives in this period, though its exact evolution remains debated. What matters for this early era is the shift toward coordinated tactics and specialized equipment. Shields, spears, javelins, and occasionally scale armor appear in graves and depictions, showing that warbands included a mix of lightly armed skirmishers and heavier troops. The rise of hill forts further suggests a strategy focused on controlling choke points rather than seeking decisive set-piece battles on open ground. Foreign contacts in these centuries were not limited to the Greeks. To the east and northeast, Scythian groups influenced local styles of horse harness, quivers, and art motifs. The steppe brought techniques for mounted archery and fast raids, while also opening a pipeline for new forms of elite display, ornamented belts, gold plaques, and animal-style decoration. To the west and northwest, contacts with early Celtic groups would later introduce Latin styles of weaponry and personal adornment. In the 7th to 5th centuries BCE, however, the clearest exchanges were with Greek colonies and with steppe peoples along the Black Sea coast. These interactions created both opportunities and threats. Access to new weapons and horses could empower ambitious leaders. Yet, steppe raids also devastated undefended areas, pushing communities to fortify and to seek alliances. The cause and effect loop is visible. Outside pressure fostered internal coordination. Internal coordination produced larger political units. Language and identity, while difficult to reconstruct, show continuity across this long span. Place name patterns and personal names recorded by ancient authors point to a Thracian linguistic substrate with local variants. Over time, the label Getae tends to appear in contexts closer to the lower Danube and the Black Sea, while Dacians appear more often in accounts focused on the interior mountains. The distinction may be geographic and political rather than strictly ethnic, and it matters because it foreshadows later state formation. A mountain core, oriented toward mining and hill forts, would be suited to a centralized monarchy. A riverine and coastal fringe, with multiple trading nodes and mixed communities, would support looser networks led by chiefs who balanced local interests with long-distance commerce. The future Dacian kingdom emerges from that mountain core, but its roots drink deeply from both zones. Material culture helps us see how these communities lived. Pottery styles blend local handmade wares with wheel-turned forms learned from Greek artisans. Textile tools, spindle whorls, and loom weights indicate household production of cloth, while metal finds show the coexistence of bronze and iron in tools and ornaments. Burials range from simple inhumations to richer graves with imported vessels and weaponry, suggesting social stratification. In some cemeteries, clusters of wealthier graves may indicate lineages that controlled trade routes or ore resources. Such families likely formed the seedbed of the later aristocracy, known as the Terabastes. Their authority, however, depended on constant performance, successful raiding, wise judgment, generous feasting, and secure relations with Greek partners. The Greek colonies themselves were not isolated outposts, but active players in inland politics. Histria, on the lower Danube coast, minted coins that circulated inland. Its merchants contracted for grain, fish, salt, and hides. Tomis and Calatis, farther south on the coast, functioned as hubs for Black Sea shipping and conduits for Aegean goods. When local rulers protected caravan routes and port access, Greek towns prospered. When conflict disrupted exchange, the cities negotiated with new partners or hired mercenaries. These dynamics encouraged inland elites to project order, at least along key corridors. Stability paid, and that lesson would echo when later kings forged stronger polities. Environmental factors also shaped society. The Danube floodplain produced rich soils but demanded knowledge of seasonal rhythms. Fishing, fowling, and salt extraction rounded out subsistence, while the uplands provided seasonal pastures for herds. Salt, in particular, was a strategic asset. Springs and mines in the Carpathians supplied a commodity essential for preserving food and maintaining livestock. Control over salt sites and their distribution likely underpinned early regional power. Add to this the availability of copper, iron, and potentially gold in the mountains, and we can see why hill forts guarded not only people but also resource flows. When a community could move salt, ore, and surplus grain to a coastal emporium, it could secure amphorae of wine, fine ceramics, and metal fittings, which in turn reinforced the status of the ruling families at home. Law and custom developed alongside these economic and political changes. While we lack written codes from this period, patterns of settlement, ritual, and burial imply norms that organized life and death. A warrior's weapons in his grave speak to honor codes. Offerings at hilltop sanctuaries speak to shared obligations between leaders and the divine. As disputes grew more complex over pasture rights, river crossings, or tribute from dependent villages, leaders needed councils and respected mediators. In later centuries, a figure named Dacian would be celebrated as a priest lawgiver, but the roots of such authority belong to this earlier time, when religious expertise and adjudication helped balance force with legitimacy. The Getes' visibility in Greek sources rises in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE as Greek colonies increasingly depended on inland suppliers and as larger geopolitical forces touched the region. Persian campaigns into the Balkans in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE created brief moments of upheaval, reminding northern communities that distant empires could reach their doorstep. A generation later, the expanding Macedonian power under kings like Philip II and Alexander the Great reshaped the South Balkan world. Even if direct Macedonian control did not extend far across the Danube during this period, the ripple effects mattered. Trade routes shifted, mercenaries moved, and new diplomatic patterns emerged. Inland chiefs learned to navigate a world where alignment with one external power could bring advantages against another. It is worth pausing on the human dimension behind these broad strokes. Imagine a village clustered below a hill fort, smoke rising from hearths where bread bakes and iron is hammered. Children carry baskets of grain. Elders tell stories of ancestors who crossed rivers and claimed the ridgeline above. A caravan arrives with Greek pottery painted in styles unlike anything seen last harvest. The village headman hosts a feast, opening amphorae whose stamped handles testify to distant workshops. Songs praise the generosity of the host and the bravery of young men who will soon patrol the valley. A priest marks the turning of the season with offerings at a wooden shrine, reminding all that prosperity depends on right conduct. None of this is fiction so much as a synthesis of what remains. Pottery shards, earthworks, hearths, and the words of travelers who saw in these people both kinship and difference. The world north of the lower Danube did not stand still after the rise of fortified hill communities and expanding exchange networks. During the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, new peoples pressed into the region from several directions, bringing fresh tactics, styles, and ambitions. These movements did not erase the local cultures related to the Thracians. Instead, they forced inland leaders to adapt. As pressure mounted, small coalitions hardened into larger confederations, and local chiefs learned to negotiate with distant powers. In this crucible, the political and military habits that would later define the Dacian kingdom took clearer shape. From the northeast came riders linked to the Scythian world, heirs to steppe traditions of swift raiding and mounted archery. Their presence along the Black Sea corridor had been felt earlier, but in this period they became regular actors in the affairs of inland communities. The steppe offered mobility and shock. It also spread a language of elite display. Animal-style ornaments, decorated quivers, and distinctive short swords signaled rank, while horse gear and composite bows promised speed and reach. Inland leaders learned quickly that a dispute handled on foot could be decided at a gallop. To protect pastures and caravan paths, chiefs began to field more cavalry and to think in terms of patrol belts rather than single palisades. The cause and effect is clear. Exposure to steppe warfare rewarded those who could coordinate mounted scouts, control river crossings, and maintain warning systems between hilltops. To the northwest and west, Celtic groups moved through the Carpathian Basin, traveling and settling in waves that scholars associate with the Latin horizon. Their arrival is visible not only in weapon types and ornaments, but also in new approaches to craft production and social organization. Long slashing swords, oval shields, and iron spearheads entered local arsenals. Chainmail and helmet forms spread, offering improved protection to elite warriors. At the same time, Celtic metalwork, fibulae, torques, decorated scabbards, introduced fresh visual codes of status. Workshops increasingly specialized, and itinerant smiths turned martial fashion into a networked industry. When chiefs could reward followers with finely made gear, they could bind larger retinues to their cause. Pressure from well-armed neighbors did not merely threaten, it incentivized upgrading. Celtic influence also touched economic life. Silver coins minted in the Macedonian world found their way north through trade and mercenary service, and soon Celtic artisans began striking imitations adapted to local tastes. By the later 3rd century before the Common Era, imitative coinage circulated widely in inland markets and along the Danube. Coin use did more than ease exchange. It created a common measure for tribute, mercenary pay, and fines, which in turn encouraged more formal authority. When a chief could demand a fixed payment in silver rather than in cattle or grain, he could fund standing forces and commission fortification work on a reliable schedule. Again, cause and effect. Coinage supported planning, and planning supported scale. A defining political episode in this era involves the Getae under a leader remembered as Dromichates. In the early 3rd century before the Common Era, the Macedonian ruler Lysimachus campaigned north of the Haemus ranges, seeking to impose control over the lower Danube. The expedition did not end as he expected. Greek and later sources report that Dromichates captured Lysimachus and, after demonstrating both power and restraint, released him following a formal agreement. The details vary across texts, but the lesson is consistent. Inland leaders could force even a major Hellenistic ruler to bargain, and diplomacy backed by disciplined forces could yield better outcomes than scorched earth. The episode matters because it shows an emerging confidence among Danubian elites and a new style of interstate negotiation, a hostage treated with honor, a banquet to display wealth and order, a treaty that recognizes borders and obligations. Such performance politics relied on steady logistics, fortified strongholds, and the ability to move men quickly along known routes. In short, it required the same administrative habits that later kings would deploy on a larger scale. The arrival of the Bastarnae, a people whose cultural profile blends steppe and Central European elements, added another layer of complexity by the later 3rd century before the Common Era. They established themselves in the northern reaches of the lower Danube world, sometimes allying with inland chiefs, sometimes clashing with them. Their mobility and martial skill reinforced the general trend. Defense could not be static. Chiefs who secured passes one season might need to negotiate with new neighbors the next. Alliances became pragmatic and transactional. A winter pact might secure mercenary riders, a summer campaign might dissolve the arrangement and require a new one. These rhythms of agreement and rupture taught inland leaders to keep surplus reserves, maintain messenger networks, and cultivate multiple partners at once. Fortified settlements responded in kind. Earlier hilltop refuges grew into more complex centers, with terraced zones for storage, workshops, and sanctuaries. Builders experimented with more stable wall systems, layering earth, timber, and stone in ways that could absorb pressure and resist fire. Gates were set to overlook approach roads. Cisterns and channels were considered as part of defensive planning. Because attackers now carried longer swords, larger shields, and in some cases mail, defenders adjusted. Palisade heights and ditch depths rose, and watchtowers coordinated signal fires across ridges. The shift is not measured only in walls, but in the managerial culture behind them. Standardizing timber sizes, scheduling quarry work, and feeding crews on long projects. This organizational discipline would become one of the signatures of later Dacian strongholds. Warrior culture evolved alongside these material changes. A young noble no longer proved himself solely by a raid against a neighboring village. He needed to master riding, spear drill, shield work, and, increasingly, disciplined formations that held ground against charges and countercharges. Leaders demanded scouts who could judge distances and mark ambush points. They wanted craftsmen who could repair chain links and mount fittings under pressure. Honor codes adjusted to prize reliability and coordinated action, not only individual bravado. Feasting remained central, but it now celebrated sustained campaigns, successful negotiations with foreign captains, and the fulfillment of treaty terms. The human texture shifts from episodic raiding to seasonally planned operations. Religion and ideology also adapted to the new environment. Without repeating earlier discussions of belief, it is enough to note that contact with steppe and Celtic practices added layers to ritual life. Horse burials and solar motifs appeared in some zones. Offerings tied to weapon deposition marked sacred spaces associated with victory and oath-taking. Priests and seers gained influence as interpreters of signs not just for harvests, but for campaigns, alliances, and the proper treatment of captives. Their guidance helped transform military success into moral legitimacy, a pattern that later reformers would formalize. The Greek cities on the coast found themselves recalibrating as well. Inland chiefs who could enforce safe passage earned preferential terms. Those who could not were bypassed. Traders learned the reputations of particular strongholds and adjusted routes accordingly. When a coalition guaranteed order along a river corridor, amphorae and finished goods flowed inland. When rival groups contested the same stretch, coin hoards grew as households buried savings in uncertain times. The archaeological record shows this pattern clearly. Concentrations of silver buried in moments of stress, then redeposited wealth when stability returned. The cycle made a lasting impression on inland leaders, who saw that predictable rule paid dividends in both goods and loyalty. Mercenary service formed another bridge between worlds. Young warriors from inland communities hired themselves to Hellenistic rulers, learned new drills in siegecraft, and returned home with pay, experience, and stories of distant courts. In exchange, Greek captains recruited mounted scouts and light infantry who knew the rivers, marshes, and passes. The exchange of skills and the circulation of veterans accelerated military learning. Techniques for building rams and ladders, for cutting water supplies, and for timing assaults at dawn or dusk entered local repertoires. Siegecraft moved from rumor to practice, and with it came new respect for supply lines and intelligence. Over the course of these 2 centuries, political language sharpened. Greek writers increasingly used the word for king to describe certain inland leaders, recognizing that some chiefs now spoke for wider territories and could enforce treaties. Titles mattered because they reflected real capacities: to levy men quickly, to standardize dues, to adjudicate disputes across valleys. This consolidation did not mean uniformity. Some regions still followed looser clan leadership, others formed compact confederations under dominant houses. But the direction of travel was toward larger units that could negotiate with outside powers on something like equal terms. The balance between mobility and fortification also found a new equilibrium. Earlier communities had leaned heavily on walls as refugees. Now leaders combined fixed strongholds with mobile strike forces and screening cavalry. They could choose to defend a pass, raid a supply train, or shadow an invading column without committing to a pitched battle. This flexibility made alliances more credible and deterrence more effective. A visiting envoy could be shown fortified terraces and neatly stacked timber for repairs. He could also see mounted men depart within moments with clear signals and pre-arranged rendezvous points. Legitimacy had become legible in both stone and motion. Cultural exchange left marks in daily life beyond the battlefield. Jewelry styles blended local and Celtic forms. Drinking gear and banquet customs evolved, and dress incorporated imported elements without surrendering local identity. In some cemeteries, graves of women include rich adornments that suggest their roles in alliance building, gift exchange, and the maintenance of lineage status. Marriages cemented ties not only between neighboring villages, but across ethnic lines, weaving a web of obligation that could stabilize border zones. In this sense, diplomacy began at the household level and scaled upward. A cluster of strongholds and trading corridors can defend a countryside, but it does not yet make a state. To turn seasonal coalitions into a durable polity, leaders north of the lower Danube needed a common rulebook, a shared moral language, and institutions that outlived any single warband. In the early to mid-1st century before the Common Era, a program of sacred authority answered that need. At its center stands the figure remembered as Dacian, a priest and lawgiver whose influence, as later writers tell it, reshaped the political culture that would soon support a unified Dacian kingdom. Ancient authors, writing generations later, describe Dacian as a man of learning who taught ethics, astronomy, and practical judgment to the elites of the Getae and Dacians. Their testimonies are colored by distance and agenda, but the broad contours align with what archaeology and political logic suggest. A religious specialist who could arbitrate disputes and interpret the heavens offered more than ceremonies. He offered a framework for order. When chiefs and nobles adopted a shared calendar, a common set of oaths, and standardized penalties, streams of allegiance that once ran separately began to merge. The political problem was pressing. New neighbors from the steppe and the west had raised the stakes of disunity. Raids could undo a harvest. Rival claimants could turn a frontier into a fissure. Religious authority gave inland leaders a way to coordinate without surrendering entirely to another house. A council convened under sacred sanction could render decisions that felt binding because they were presented as more than the will of a stronger clan. In this setting, Dacian and his circle appear as architects of a moral covenant that stitched hill communities into a wider whole. Sources link Dacian to reforms that divided society into clearly marked orders. Later texts describe an aristocracy whose members wore a felt cap and a commoner class identified by long hair, terms that later scholars render as the Tarabostes or Piliati and the Comati. Whether the symbolism is reported with precision or not, the political purpose is clear. By codifying rank, the reformers created channels of responsibility. Nobles owed counsel, judgment, and military leadership. Commoners owed labor service and levy dues. All owed obedience to decisions taken in council and affirmed at sanctuaries. Codified rank replaced improvisation with expectation. Law took on more formal shapes. Instead of settling quarrels with personal vengeance or ad hoc compensation, councils applied set fines and procedures. Witnesses were named, sureties pledged, and deadlines established. Such routines demanded records, whether memorized by priests or marked through tokens and tallies. Standardization had obvious effects. If a cattle fine for theft was known and predictable, households could plan, and feuds cooled. Predictability strengthened trade as well. Greek merchants and inland caravans could accept contracts enforced by custom because they knew which council would decide a claim and which sanctuary would guarantee an oath. Religion, in this world, was not an escape from politics. It was the ground on which politics stood. Dacian did not simply bless campaigns. He taught the noble class a shared way of understanding time, season, and duty. Accounts emphasize instruction in the movements of the stars and the calendar. This matters because a calendar coordinates everything: sowing and harvest, levy musters, tribute days, and festival courts. Align the sky with the schedule, and discipline follows. A shared calendar also turned scattered sanctuaries into a network of synchronized authority. When the same feast day was kept across valleys, priests could issue the same rulings at the same time, and rulers could muster men with fewer delays. The moral code that accompanied these reforms emphasized sobriety, discipline, and obedience to command. Later authors connect a ban or curtailment of wine to the effort to harden troops and restrain excess. Whether such measures were uniform or seasonal, the aim is plain: Leaders wanted soldiers and laborers who could endure long works on walls and roads, travel light on patrol, and hold formation in battle. Sacralizing restraint turned practical needs into virtues. When a levy abstained because the gods demanded it as the price of success, enforcement needed less coercion. The sanctuaries themselves became centers of administration. On high terraces, priests presided over oath rituals in which litigants stood before altars, touched sacred tokens, and spoke formulas that bound them to decisions. Offerings were deposited in pits or on stone platforms, marking agreements with visible signs. The landscape of the future capital zone, with its circular and rectangular platforms, hints at the ceremonial choreography that such a system required. Sacred spaces doubled as forums where tribute was counted, fines collected, and decrees announced. By uniting cult and court, reformers ensured that defiance looked like sacrilege as much as rebellion. Infrastructure followed ideology. The same network that carried priests and messengers also moved inspectors who measured storehouses, counted livestock for levy obligations, and checked the readiness of local garrisons. Fortification projects in the mountain core adopted more systematic construction methods, with timber, stone, and earth layered in ways that could be taught, repeated, and supervised by appointed foremen. Standardization quickened work and made repairs predictable. When there is a common plan, one crew can finish what another began. When there is a common oath, one leader can rely on another's pledge to supply timber, stone, or teams of oxen by a fixed festival date. Economy and faith interlocked. Ore from the mountains and salt from springs were considered not just resources but trusts to be managed under sacred oversight. Temples acted as treasuries where a portion of mining output or caravan tolls could be stored and guarded. That storage, sanctified by ritual, reassured contributors that their dues were not simply a chief's private hoard. Priests who kept the keys did so in the name of the community and the gods, and nobles who borrowed from these reserves did so against oaths that could be enforced at the next council day. The effect was to turn surplus into a public instrument, grain to feed workers on walls, metals to pay specialists, and gifts to seal treaties. Education of the elite took on new forms. Young nobles studied not only weapons and riding, but also dispute procedure, seasonal scheduling, and the art of giving counsel without causing offense. Priests trained them in the language of omens and auspicious days, which functioned as a diplomatic tool. If an envoy delayed a decision by citing the calendar, both sides saved face and time. If a chief proposed a campaign schedule that tracked with sacred days already respected across valleys, he could muster support more easily. Learning, in this sense, was statecraft. Diplomacy beyond the Danube likewise drew on the new moral theater. Foreign envoys were received at sanctuaries where judgments were issued and oaths sworn, and they witnessed the orderly counting of tribute or the staged remission of penalties as a gesture of clemency. The message to neighbors and rivals was straightforward. This was a people governed by law and capable of promise-keeping. In a borderland crowded with opportunists, such a reputation could be more valuable than a larger levy. Greek merchants preferred predictable partners. Steppe captains preferred allies who kept terms. Sacred authority thus multiplied the reach of limited resources. The reforms also changed the social compact at the village level. Farmers and herders now knew how many days of labor service were expected each season and to whom they would answer during levy musters. Headmen held seals or tokens that represented obligations fulfilled so that quotas were not demanded twice. Because priests supervised the calendar, they could protect vital agricultural windows from arbitrary summons. This produced a culture in which public obligations felt regular and comprehensible, and it protected the food base on which everything else depended. Military organization matured within this framework. Councils appointed captains for passes and river crossings, specified garrison sizes, and required periodic inspections of arms and walls. Because legal penalties and fines were now standardized, captains could discipline negligence without inflaming local resentment. Soldiers were paid in measured rations, metal pieces, and the promise of captured goods divided under rules known in advance. Oath rituals at sanctuaries confirmed these arrangements before campaigns, making mutiny both a legal and a religious offense. The result was a more reliable fighting force that could sustain multi-season operations. The ideological program left visible marks on material culture. Ceremonial objects used in councils, standardized weights, and carefully shaped architectural elements speak to an aesthetic of order. Ornament patterns repeat across sites, implying coordinated workshops or shared templates. In such details, we glimpse the core of the project, to replace the improvisation of loose coalitions with the predictability of institutions. When temple platforms across the mountain core share dimensions and layout principles, when council tokens bear similar marks, a traveler can move from valley to valley without feeling lost in translation. None of this erased internal rivalries. Strong houses still competed for prestige, and the temptation to expand influence at a neighbor's expense did not vanish. What changed was the toolkit for managing those tensions. A house that felt wronged could appeal to a higher council rather than mobilize at once. A chief negotiating a marriage alliance could count on customary dowry measures to prevent insult. Even when ambition flared, the presence of a shared law made it easier to form coalitions against a spoiler, since all parties could argue from the same rules. Later tradition ties Decianus closely to these innovations, crediting him with the wisdom that made a people more disciplined and, in the eyes of outsiders, more formidable. Whether every feature of the program traces to one guiding mind is less important than the institutional fact. By the middle decades of the 1st century before the Common Era, the mountain core of the Dacian world had developed a religious legal framework capable of unifying action. Sacred authority did not replace kingship. It prepared the way for a kingship that would be more than personal charisma. The consequences were immediate. With councils synchronized and sanctuaries acting as administrative centers, it became possible to levy larger forces without crippling agriculture, to concentrate labor for major projects without provoking revolt, and to negotiate with foreign powers from a position of coherence. Merchants saw fewer arbitrary tolls and more predictable markets. Veterans returned from service abroad to find institutions ready to absorb their skills. Fortresses no longer rose in isolation. They formed chains that protected corridors and signaled a central plan. When a society learns to coordinate through shared law and sacred time, the next step is political concentration. In the 1st century before the Common Era, that step took a human shape in the figure of Burebista, a commander and ruler who transformed scattered hill polities into a single, assertive kingdom. Classical writers remembered him as a leader who forged unity with discipline, piety, and relentless campaigning. What distinguishes his story is not just conquest, but the way he harnessed existing religious authority and administrative habits to produce a kingdom that could operate at scale. Burebista rose in a landscape crowded with rivals. To the west and northwest, Celtic groups still held pockets in the Carpathian Basin. To the east, steppe forces tied to the Black Sea coast could intervene along river routes. To the south, Hellenistic and then Roman power influenced the lower Danube. Within the hills and valleys themselves, strong houses competed for precedence. Burebista's breakthrough lay in turning these pressures into arguments for unity. He offered chiefs a bargain, recognition and security in exchange for obedience to a central command that promised predictable tribute, integrated fortifications, and coordinated defense. Ancient testimony credits Burebista with a program of moral discipline that served military ends. Strabo, writing in the early imperial period, presents a ruler who, with the counsel of a priestly advisor remembered as Decianus, reshaped customs to harden his people. A famous measure limited or removed the use of wine, not as an act of austerity for its own sake, but as part of a wider tempering of habits. The logic is practical. A levy that abstains from excess keeps ranks steadier on the march, tolerates the long work of wall building, and resists panic at the first shock. By sacralizing discipline, Burebista turned everyday restraint into a patriotic duty. With discipline as foundation, he reorganized command. Local nobles who previously mustered men for their own quarrels now received defined responsibilities within a larger framework: passes to guard, river crossings to patrol, storehouses to keep, and mustering points to maintain on fixed calendar days. The shared calendar that priests had taught became a strategic instrument. When a summons went out, captains already knew the cycles for levy rotation, the festival days protected from military use, and the oaths that bound every participant to a chain of command. This synchronization did not erase local pride, it channeled it into performance metrics that could be seen and rewarded. Campaigns followed quickly. To the west and northwest, Burebista moved against Celtic groups whose long swords and elite ornaments had once set the fashion across the region. Strabo names the Boii and the Taurici among those crushed or displaced. These actions were not raids, but decisive operations designed to remove rival power centers close to the mountain core. By clearing the Carpathian approaches, Burebista secured a strategic horizon. No more rival coinage, no more alternate markets drawing away caravans, and no more rival chiefs hiring mercenaries on the kingdom's doorstep. Victory here produced compounding effects. Consolidated control of upland resources meant more reliable access to iron, salt, and precious metals. More resources meant better pay for specialists. Better pay brought more reliable fortification crews and a steadier army. To the east and southeast, Burebista projected influence toward the western Black Sea coast. Greek cities such as Histria, Tomis, and Calatis had long mediated inland trade. Under Burebista, that mediation tilted toward subordination. In some cases, he imposed a protectorate. In others, he took more direct control, ensuring that customs dues and market decisions aligned with his treasury's needs. The motive was both economic and strategic. With coastal nodes secure, hostile fleets or foreign-backed factions could not easily cut off inland supply lines or manipulate river traffic. Inland merchants gained a clearer path for exports of grain, livestock, salt, and metals, while the king gained the means to purchase what he most needed: skilled artisans, specialists in siege work, and diplomatic gifts that traveled well. Diplomacy ran in parallel with war. Burebista understood the performance aspect of rule. Envoys from allied or intimidated towns saw storehouses filled to marked levels, walls maintained on schedule, and courts held at sanctuaries with the expected ritual gravity. These displays communicated reliability. A ruler who kept his own measures and dates could be trusted to keep treaties and tribute arrangements. This reputation mattered when balancing pressures from larger powers. South of the river, Roman commanders and client kings watched the northern frontier. To the east, remaining steppe groups probed for advantage. Burebista's court presented a consistent face: a kingdom with laws and a ruler with the means to enforce them. Army organization reflected this coherence. Infantry remained the backbone, equipped with spears, shields, and in some units, the distinctive curved blades that would later alarm Roman riders. Cavalry, trained for reconnaissance and quick strikes, extended the army's eyes and hands across the passes and river plains. Crucially, Burebista invested in engineers and sappers. Earlier generations had learned the outlines of siegecraft through mercenary service and observation. Now the kingdom maintained its own corps capable of building rams, towers, and ladders, of undermining walls, and of cutting or guarding water supplies. This was the difference between episodic raiding and territorial control: the ability to reduce a fortified place without relying on starvation or betrayal alone. The kingdom's heartland, in the mountains of the Orushti range, grew into a dense belt of strongholds tied together by roads, signal lines, and a shared architectural language. Terraces were cut with care, walls were built with layered timber and stone in a pattern that resisted scaling and fire. Gates were placed where approach routes could be raked by defenders. Sanctuaries stood near administrative platforms, underscoring the unified nature of judgment, musters, and worship. Because the plan repeated across the core, an officer moved from one site to another without needing to relearn procedures. This standardization made replacements and reinforcements efficient. It also signaled to visitors that they stood within a system, not at the whim of a single chief's taste. Economic policy, kept pace. Burebista's agents oversaw weights and measures in markets, confirmed coin standards where coinage circulated, and set predictable tolls along caravan routes. The aim was not to squeeze every trader, but to keep traffic flowing under conditions that enriched the center. Mines and salt springs delivered regular portions to the treasury. Forest and pasture dues were collected at times that protected agricultural rhythms. Public stores allowed the king to feed large work crews and to sustain levies on extended campaigns without stripping local communities bare. The message to households was calculated: serve on schedule, pay what custom now defines, and you will be protected and fed when the kingdom calls. One of Burebista's less obvious achievements was the creation of a political language that made his gains durable. He styled himself not only as a victorious war leader, but as the guardian of law and religion. Priests blessed campaigns and also audited obligations. Councils that once arbitrated local disputes now reviewed provincial affairs, turning regional nobles into officers of the state. By placing respected figures in charge of judicial and religious duties within each district, Burebista turned potential rivals into stakeholders in the central project. The conversion of ambition into service is a hallmark of successful state builders, and here it occurred under the cover of shared sanctity and common law. Relations with neighbors were calibrated to buy time and maximize advantage. To the south, the Roman world was convulsed by civil war. During these struggles, Burebista weighed alignments carefully. Sources suggest he leaned toward the faction of Pompey the Great, whose enmity with Julius Caesar promised Rome's distraction from Danubian affairs. If Pompey prevailed, a grateful partner might tolerate a strong Dacian presence along the coast and in the river valleys. If he failed, the kingdom would at least have used the breathing space to strengthen its core. In the meantime, Burebista made his presence felt. Greek coastal towns carved dedications that acknowledged his rule. Inland communities that hesitated found themselves pressured until they conformed. While he drew on priestly authority, Burebista did not govern as a temple puppet. His choices reveal a strategic mind, comfortable with both carrots and sticks. He rewarded houses that delivered on levy quotas and fortification schedules with gifts, market privileges, and marriage alliances into the ruling circle. He punished recalcitrant chiefs with confiscations and, when necessary, with decisive force that ended the possibility of future resistance. Conquered groups were not all treated alike. Some were relocated to dilute their cohesion. Others were left in place under watchful overseers who held hostages as guarantees. The goal was uniformity of obedience, not uniformity of culture, and it worked well enough to sustain a wide realm. Burebista's court became a magnet for talent. Artisans specialized in weapons, jewelry, and architectural elements. Interpreters and scribes, whether trained at coastal cities or locally, managed correspondence and contracts. Veterans of foreign service advised on siege plans and diplomacy. Banquets at the court displayed controlled abundance, enough to impress, not enough to undercut the moral message of discipline. Visiting envoys saw both spectacle and order. Ranks of retainers who knew their stations, priests who spoke in measured tones about sacred days, and officers who could recite levy tables without hesitation. This was political theater that communicated capacity. The ideological frame tightened as well. Public ceremonies celebrated victories as restorations of cosmic balance rather than merely the triumph of one house. Offerings at sanctuaries linked royal success to divine favor and collective merit. When a stronghold fell after a long siege, the narrative emphasized the rightness of the cause, the purity of the conduct, and the justice of the penalties imposed. Such storytelling mattered in a world where memory was a tool of governance. A subject who believed the king ruled with sacred approval obeyed more readily and judged rivals as rebels against gods as well as laws. By the mid-40s before the Common Era, Burebista's kingdom stretched across a broad arc of the Danubian world. Control did not mean uniform administration in every valley, but the key features were present. A coherent heartland with standardized strongholds, subjugated or allied neighbors to west and east, coastal cities under influence, and an army capable of sustained operations under a central plan. The fiscal spine held under the weight of campaigns and building projects, and the moral code that underwrote the discipline of nobles and levies had not collapsed under success. In terms visible to outsiders, this was the closest thing the region had seen to a state that could confront a Mediterranean great power as a peer, yet success sharpened dangers. The same Roman world that had been distracted by civil war was on the verge of consolidation under Julius Caesar, a commander with a personal interest in the Danubian frontier and a track record of moving quickly from plan to action. Classical sources hint that Caesar prepared a campaign toward the Dacian realm, an enterprise that would test the new kingdom's resilience. Whether he intended a punitive expedition, a demonstration of force, or something more enduring, his attention alone raised the stakes. Burebista's alignment with Caesar's rival made matters even more fraught. A powerful neighbor unified under a victorious Caesar would not look kindly on a large, independent polity that had shaped the western Black Sea in its favor. When Burebista finished binding the Danubian interior into a single command, he found a Mediterranean world convulsed by rival Roman strongmen. This instability created both room to maneuver and reasons to fear. The kingdom could grow while Roman attention was elsewhere. Yet any Roman victor would eventually turn north and test the new power beyond the river. That was the strategic horizon as the feud between Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar escalated from courtroom rhetoric to marching legions. Burebista chose his alignment with care. Pompey represented the party of established aristocrats and provincial networks. He controlled fleets and had allies from Spain to the eastern Mediterranean. For a northern ruler, partnership with Pompey promised continuity along the western Black Sea and time to absorb newly subdued Celtic and coastal territories. Caesar, by contrast, moved quickly and punished hesitation. His record in Gaul showed how he dismantled confederations by splitting allies, forcing hostages, and building roads and bridges at astonishing speed. From the Dacian viewpoint, a distracted Rome was safer than a unified Rome led by a relentless innovator. So Burebista leaned toward Pompey. This choice was not only ideological, it was transactional. Pompeian agents sought grain, horses, and timber for shipbuilding. They promised recognition of influence along the western Black Sea and tolerance of Dacian arrangements with coastal towns. In return, Burebista could regulate harbors and river mouths without immediate Roman intervention. He could also present himself to Greek city councils as the guarantor of order in a season of Roman uncertainty. That reputation mattered. Market days and sailing schedules depend on predictability more than on sentiment, and Burebista offered predictable dues and security on inland roads. Even so, Roman memory along the lower Danube contained reminders that northern foes could not be taken lightly. A generation earlier, a Roman commander named Gaius Antonius Hybrida had suffered defeat at the hands of Getic forces near the river crossings. That embarrassment had taught Roman officers that swift raids across the Danube and ambushes in marshy ground could unseat even an arrogant governor. Burebista, who commanded forces far more organized than those earlier war bands, represented a challenge on a different scale. Roman bureaucrats kept lists, fortresses noted, caravan flows measured, allies cultivated. The northern kingdom was in their ledgers, and Caesar was a man who read his ledgers. As Caesar and Pompey prepared for open war, Burebista strengthened the levers that turned influence into obedience. He placed loyal governors in sensitive districts, kept coastal communities close by, mixing generosity with pressure, and reminded nobles that the kingdom's recent prosperity depended on the central plan. The message worked because it was true. Coin finds and trade debris suggest robust exchange across the western Black Sea during these years, the kind of movement that only stable customs and protected roads can produce. Inside the mountain core, fortification crews continued to terrace slopes, reinforce walls, and build the water systems that turned hilltop centers into places that could outlast sieges. An enemy might cross the Danube in a burst of bravado. He would not easily cut through a belt of coordinated strongholds supplied by stores counted in sacred precincts. Then came the pivot. Caesar marched on Rome, Pompey vacated Italy, and the Great Civil War swept across the Mediterranean. For a time, this storm seemed to favor Burebista. Rome's best legions were occupied far to the west and south. The generals who mattered watched each other, not the Danube. Yet the same speed that made Caesar dangerous also contained a peril for anyone who had gambled against him. After routing Pompey at Pharsalus, Caesar refilled his calendar of campaigns. Classical writers report that he planned a major eastern enterprise aimed first at Dacia and the Parthian world beyond, a demonstration that the conquering energy of the Gallic Wars was not spent. Whether the Danubian phase was to be a punitive raid, a stabilizing intervention, or a lasting occupation is debated. What matters is that the Roman victor had the kingdom in his sights. Burebista could read the map as clearly as Caesar. The Danube can be bridged. Passes can be forced. A series of sieges can grind down even the best prepared strongholds. To meet such a challenge, the kingdom needed a unified command and a clear succession plan, because Caesar would exploit even a hint of internal division. This was the fragile point in Burebista's construction. The system depended on the presence of a skilled arbiter at the top, one who held priests, nobles, and provincial captains in a delicate balance. He had crafted institutions that synchronized courts, musters, and tribute, but ultimate authority still flowed through a single mind. Events moved faster than either rival could have anticipated. In the year that Romans would later date to the Ides of March, conspirators in Rome assassinated Caesar. At almost the same time, Burebista himself was killed, likely in a coup among the Dacian nobility. Whether his death was linked in any way to Roman intrigues remains uncertain, and the sources are silent on the exact motives. What is clear is the effect. The great kingdom split. Strabo, writing not long after, speaks of the realm dividing into several parts. Tradition often reduces this to four, each under its own leader. Strong houses reclaimed autonomy. Governors who had been the king's men now spoke for provinces. Coastal ties loosened as Greek cities recalculated their risks. This fragmentation did not mean a return to the loose coalitions of earlier centuries. The habits Burebista had established did not evaporate overnight. Law still marked calendar days. Strongholds still followed standardized plans. Priests still presided at councils that set dues and adjudicated disputes. But without the central figure to align schedules and punish spoilers, coordination faltered. A levy summoned in one district might not march unless a neighboring district also moved. A fortress commander might delay repairs, betting that no inspector would arrive from the capital. The cost of that slippage was not visible immediately, yet it accumulated. Rivals across the borders could sense when a network no longer acted as one organism. The coastal cities adjusted with the reflexes of seasoned survivors. Histria, Tomis, and Calatus negotiated with the nearest strongman who could credibly protect harbors and roads, hedging their bets by sending gifts to more than one inland court. Commercial life continued, but tolls multiplied and dues varied. Mercenaries found opportunities as competing Dacian leaders sought to demonstrate strength. The old pattern returned. When the hinterland was divided, coin hoards grew as people concealed wealth against the uncertainty of tomorrow's ruler. Across the Danube, Roman policy evolved under new masters. The death of Caesar did not restore the old republican balance. It ushered in years of vengeance, bargaining, and new coalitions. The men who dominated Rome after the conspirators fell, men like Mark Antony and Octavian, valued the Danubian frontier as a recruiting ground, a granary, and a flank that could not be left to chance. They worked to stabilize Thrace with client kings and to intimidate or entice northern leaders into predictable relationships. Moment by moment, they tested what remained of Burebista's long reach. One intriguing signal from this time comes from gold coins inscribed with the name Kosun found in Transylvanian hoards. The coins bear Roman-style imagery linked to the faction of Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins. Scholars debate the exact story behind them, but the implications are plain enough. At least one Dacian ruler struck coinage that echoed Roman political symbolism and, likely, accepted payments or promises from Roman actors eager for allies. This was a two-way street. Dacian leaders learned to play Roman factions off one another. Roman leaders learned that northern kings could be courted as partners in wider struggles. The long-term effect was to deepen the integration of the Danubian world into Roman strategic thinking. Meanwhile, other neighbors pressed their advantage. Bands associated with the Bastarnae and Sarmatian groups probed the northern and eastern borders of the fractured kingdom. Where once a single monarch could redeploy cavalry screens and engineer units to stiffen a faltering frontier, now regional leaders met threats unevenly. Some districts held out with determination, others bargained. Borders became porous, and interior routes that had been safe under centralized watch acquired patches of danger. Traders adapted, choosing safer detours over direct paths and paying more along the way. Yet, even in fragmentation, the memory of unity survived. When a regional leader convened councils, he often did so in the language and setting crafted during Burebista's rise. Sanctuaries used as courts, public counting of dues, oaths taken at appointed seasons. Nobles agreed to serve under campaign captains for fixed periods, and artisans continued to produce standardized fittings and architectural elements. That continuity matters for what comes next. A shattered glass can be remelted. A shattered idea persists if practices remember it. The idea that the hills and valleys of the Carpathian core belonged under one law and one calendar did not vanish with the king. It simply lacked the personal authority to enforce itself. Rome, for its part, did not immediately annex the north bank of the Danube. The new masters had other fires to put out, from the struggle with the Parthians to the consolidation of power in Italy and the western provinces. But they sent signals. Scouting missions mapped crossings. Punitive expeditions tested responses. Client arrangements in Thrace and along the lower river tightened. Each move told Dacian leaders that a new equilibrium would eventually arrive, one in which Rome set the tempo. The question in the hills was who would speak for the Dacians when that day came. Inside the fractured realm, succession politics grew complicated. Strong houses assembled their own courts, complete with priestly advisors, levy tables, and fortress programs. Some tried to imitate Burebista's style, styling themselves guardians of law and patrons of the temples. Others emphasized military prowess and sought to overawe rivals with quick campaigns. Yet none could compel the entire belt of mountain strongholds to answer as one. Intermittent wars broke out among these regional polities, sometimes for control of coastal access, sometimes for dominance over key passes and mines. The costs were not only measured in casualties, but in distraction. Time spent fighting a neighbor was time not spent preparing for the next Roman move. The situation called for a recalibration rather than nostalgia. Leaders who understood the changed landscape learned to focus on defensible cores, to shore up a cluster of strongholds rather than overextend, and to cultivate relationships with the most reliable of the coastal cities. They appealed to shared customs to reduce friction with neighboring districts, framing treaties as restorations of the common order rather than as submissions to personal ambition. These habits would later matter when a new generation attempted to rebuild broader unity from a smaller base. The story of Burebista's end thus ties together several threads. Alignment with Pompey bought time, but Caesar's victory made confrontation likely. The shock of both men's assassinations released pent-up tensions on the Danube, toppling the central figure who had kept competing elites in harness. Fragmentation followed, not because the system was flimsy, but because a single, irreplaceable component had been removed. Rome watched, adapted, and positioned itself for future dominance. Neighbors raided and bargained. Regional rulers groped for formulas that balanced autonomy with the memory of a greater whole. The fall of Burebista did not scatter the Dacian world into chaos so much as break it into wary, watchful pieces. In the decades that followed, rulers along the Carpathian Arc learned to govern without the magnetism of a single king, balancing local autonomy with the memory of a larger order. What mattered now was not grand conquest, but patient consolidation, choosing defensible cores, securing steady revenue, and navigating the rising power to the south as Rome turned civil war into empire. Out of this long, uneven process came a new center of gravity in the Orashtia Mountains, where Sarmizegetusa Regia emerged as the administrative and sacred heart of a reassembled realm. The first task after fragmentation was survival. Regional leaders inherited fortified belts, levy calendars, and sanctuaries that had served a wider kingdom. They had to repurpose these tools for smaller polities while keeping open the possibility of future union. Many adopted a simple principle: defend the mountains, manage the passes, and avoid entanglements that overextended supply lines. The Orashtie Massif, with steep ridges and terraceable slopes, drew particular investment. There, builders refined construction methods already known, laying courses of dressed stone around timber frameworks and arranging terraces so that storage yards, workshops, sanctuaries, and living quarters formed an integrated complex. Water channels, cut and directed with growing sophistication, kept garrisons supplied through dry spells and sieges. The effect was quiet but cumulative. Each season, walls stood a little higher, storehouses a little fuller, procedures a little more uniform. While this interior work progressed, Rome reorganized the lower Danube. Under Augustus, the province of Moesia took shape, complete with riverine bases, roads that ran parallel to the water, and a system of client kings among the Thracian and Gaelic communities south and east of the great river. Roman legates learned the terrain and the habits of their northern neighbors. Patrols and trading missions crossed to inspect fords and to mark suitable sites for future bridging points. None of this brought Dacia under Roman rule, but it narrowed the space for improvisation. A Dacian leader who raided the south bank faced prompt counterstrokes. One who traded fairly, found markets open and customs predictable. The message from Rome was consistent. Stability under Roman eyes would be tolerated, defiance would be punished and mapped for next time. Within this new framework, Dacian politics leaned toward federation. Councils convened at sanctuaries to settle disputes between hill districts, often invoking shared legal phrases that had endured from the earlier reform era. When tempers rose, envoys reminded all parties that a public oath could save blood and preserve harvest cycles. Leaders who aspired to larger roles spoke the language of restoration rather than novelty, presenting their authority as a return to order rather than an innovation. This rhetoric mattered because it reduced the sting of pride for rival houses. To serve a stronger neighbor felt less like submission when wrapped in the shared memory of a common law. Named figures flicker through the sources like faces lit by campfire. One is Cotiso, a ruler active during the later years of Augustus, whom Roman writers remembered for negotiations that touched on dynastic marriages and obligations along the frontier. Whether every detail reported in later texts is exact matters less than the pattern it reveals. Dacian leaders bargained from recognizable capitals, managed river crossings, and could be courted or threatened by Roman commanders with clear outcomes in mind. Another name that appears in this intermediary era is Dicomes, recalled for dealings with Roman factions during the last struggles of the Republic. Together, such notices show that Dacian chiefs still operated at the scale of regional diplomacy and could affect Roman thinking about the Danube. The economy continued to knit the highlands to the sea. Greek-founded towns along the western Black Sea, Histria, Tomis, Calatis, and others, adapted to Roman oversight while maintaining old habits of inland trade. Amphorae stamped with familiar marks traveled upriver and along caravan routes into the hills, while salt, livestock, hides, and metals went out. Roman merchants brought contracts and expectations for weights and measures. Inland markets responded by reasserting standards so that disputes could be settled quickly. In practice, this meant the widening use of seals, tallies, and oath-backed receipts. A pack train passing a hill fort gate might leave with tokens that guaranteed its tax had been paid and would be recognized at the next checkpoint. The immediate effect was smoother movement. The long-term effect was the return of trust in institutions larger than any one lord's temper. Pressure from the east and northwest forced further adaptation. Sarmatian groups, most notably those remembered as Iazyges and Roxolani, pressed into the plains beyond the Carpathians. They brought with them heavier cavalry styles, long lances, and the habit of mounting swift, concentrated raids that could strike a frontier and vanish across rivers or into steppe. Dacian commanders responded by strengthening cavalry screens on the plains, improving early warning networks, and practicing the art of shadowing an enemy rather than seeking decisive battle too quickly. In the foothills, infantry drill emphasized holding narrow approaches and trapping mounted raiders on broken ground. The lessons learned here would later be applied against a more formidable southern enemy, but in this period they served to keep the Highland Corps intact and to teach young officers the virtues of patience and accurate reconnaissance. As these pressures played out, Sarmizegetusa Regia evolved from a stronghold into a system. The central terraces hosted councils and sanctuaries where oaths were sworn. Nearby workshops turned out standardized fittings, weapon parts, and architectural elements that matched the dimensions used at other forts in the Orăștie ring, sites such as Costești, Blidaru, Piatra Roșii, and Bănița. A captain transferred from one fortress to another could read the gates, the ladders, and the storage yards as if they were chapters of the same book. This familiarity reduced training time and made it easier to move units without losing efficiency. It also helped integrate newcomers. When a contingent from a valley far away arrived to reinforce a threatened pass, they found the same measures of grain, the same positions for watchfires, the same ritual formulas before a muster. Uniformity was not sterile, it was reassuring, a visible sign that they were part of something larger. Leadership styles shifted with the times. Men remembered in later traditions, such as Scorilo and Duras, who is also titled Diurpaneus in Roman accounts, appear as rulers who valued continuity, steady diplomacy, and the husbanding of strength. They did not seek to restore Burebista's wide orbit at once. Instead, they built reliable chains of command and tested Roman responses with careful probes. Under their watch, the kingdom avoided reckless provocations while preparing to act decisively if an opportunity presented itself. This meant drilling levy units to assemble quickly at prearranged points, improving intelligence across the Danube, and refining a playbook for fortification repairs that could be executed under pressure. The tone is cautious but purposeful. Strengthen the core, learn the opponent, and let time and discipline do the work that bravado cannot. Roman policy during the Julio-Claudian era reinforced this cautious approach. Rome extended military roads along the Danube, established permanent legionary bases in Moesia, and developed a fleet presence that could support rapid troop movements and supply. Raids from across the river met swift retaliation. Embassies seeking trade or clarification of boundaries found an audience but also a ledger. Roman governors kept track of which Dacian leaders honored undertakings, which held back deserters, and which harbored adventurers who disrupted the frontier. In response, Dacian courts learned to present themselves as guarantors of order, even when they quietly accepted refugees who could be useful. It was a delicate dance. Avoid giving Rome a clear casus belli while preserving freedom of action north of the river. Within this strategic quiet, cultural life continued to integrate older traditions with new influences. Workshops in the mountain core adopted decorative forms that show awareness of Roman and provincial fashions, yet they crafted them in local idioms. Spirals and geometric bands on bracelets, carefully hammered sheets on helmets and ornaments, and wooden architectural elements fitted with metal clamps in styles that balanced strength with aesthetic rhythm. Inscriptions remained rare, but the discipline of measured planning is visible in the built environment. Stairways align with drainage channels. Storage buildings are placed to ease distribution to work crews and garrisons. Sanctuary platforms allow for orderly processions during court days. Such design is not accidental. It reflects a leadership that has internalized the connection between ritual, law, and logistics. The social compact also matured. Nobles continued to serve as regional stewards, but their obligations were defined with greater specificity. They were responsible for mustering quotas, maintaining road segments, and ensuring that storehouses met minimum thresholds at fixed seasons. Priestly councils audited these obligations using tokens and tallies known across the core. Commoners, for their part, owed labor service scheduled so as not to ruin sowing and harvest windows. The reciprocal nature of the bargain was clear: meet the quota, and the state would feed workers during major projects, remit certain dues in bad seasons, and provide escorts for caravans during declared danger periods. These small guarantees turned abstract loyalty into lived experience. By the middle decades of the first century of the Common Era, the balance of power along the Danube felt steady on the surface, yet currents moved beneath. Roman attention fluctuated with crises elsewhere, from upheavals in the east to politics in Rome, opening brief windows in which northern leaders could test the frontier. Duras, remembered for later conflicts with Rome, appears in this period as a ruler consolidating the Orustia heartland while probing opportunities. He did not yet seek a climactic trial of strength. Instead, he strengthened alliances with groups beyond the Carpathian Ring who could furnish cavalry and scouts, and he cultivated informants among the traders who moved between Moesia and the highland markets. Accumulating knowledge was a strategy in itself. Along the western margins, Sarmatian power on the plains created a buffer that both threatened and protected. On one hand, steppe riders could strike Dacian herds and outlying villages. On the other, their presence complicated any Roman attempt to surround the Dacian core from multiple directions. Diplomacy here meant gifts, intermarriages, and carefully calibrated retaliations. Enough to command respect, not enough to provoke coalition. This balance demanded leaders who knew when a raid was a test and when it was an invitation to escalation. In council records reported by later writers, we glimpse the preference for limited responses. Cut off one path with a fort, reinforce one garrison, exact a compensation herd, and restore quiet. Trade continued to act as a teacher. Caravans traveling from the Black Sea to the highlands passed through mixed zones where Roman law, Greek civic custom, and Dacian practice met. Disputes were common. The solution that evolved was a pragmatic arbitration system. Cases were heard at frontier markets by panels that included representatives from each side, with oaths sworn by formulas acceptable to all. Over time, this produced a hybrid legal vocabulary and a habit of documentation that would later ease the administration of conquered zones. For now, it helped prevent small frictions from growing into campaigns. As Roman emperors changed, their legates along the Danube sought achievements they could report to the capital. Some favored punitive raids to burn out troublesome villages. Others preferred diplomacy that stabilized supply lines and kept veteran legions fresh for emergencies elsewhere. Dacian rulers learned to read these individual styles. When a hardliner commanded in Moesia, the Orustia court emphasized defensive readiness and suspended risky ventures. When a more transactional governor arrived, embassies requested market privileges or pressed for the return of deserters in exchange for guarantees of frontier calm. This sensitivity to personalities is the mark of a frontier state that has learned to survive beside a larger empire. Power in the Orustia highlands had been gathering itself for decades, learning restraint under careful rulers, cataloging Roman habits, and standardizing the strongholds that guarded the passes. The result was a realm with muscle memory, but no single mind to coordinate it at speed. That changed when Decebalus rose to prominence. He did not invent the institutions he used. He inherited a disciplined calendar, trained captains, and fortresses built to a common plan. His gift was to fuse them into an instrument sharp enough to cut into Roman strategy while flexible enough to survive Roman retaliation. The pathway to his rule ran through a period of mounting friction along the Danube. South of the river, Rome had turned the frontier into an operating system, permanent bases, river patrols, and a ladder of roads that let governors shift troops quickly. Each new governor tried to inscribe his name on this system with either diplomacy or punitive strikes. North of the river, the Dacian court under careful elders had practiced the art of limited response and patient buildup. That policy preserved strength, but it also created a cohort of young nobles restless for decisive leadership. Decebalus belonged to that cohort. Roman writers later praised and feared him in the same breath. Cassius Dio calls him a man skilled in warfare and shrewd, a concise judgment that matches the record. he planned, adapted, and learned. His first acts were inward-facing. He reviewed the chain of command that tied the Orishti ring to distant valleys, then thinned it. Where earlier rulers had tolerated overlapping jurisdictions to balance rival houses, he paired responsibilities to prevent delay. Each fortress received a captain whose duties were enumerated in clear terms: levy quotas by season, repair schedules by festival day, grain reserves by measured level, scouts by named routes. Inspectors, drawn from families that owed him loyalty, rotated through these posts to test readiness without warning. Failures brought penalties that were predictable rather than theatrical: loss of privileges, loss of command, reassignment to less visible posts, so that discipline became a routine expectation rather than a public humiliation. He next shifted training from seasonal muster to year-round craft. Infantry rehearsed not only shield walls and spear thrusts, but also the small tasks that make sieges survivable: moving earth quietly at night, disguising spoil heaps, building blind walls to absorb missiles, and cutting diversion channels that could dry a besieged cistern. Cavalry learned to ride as screens rather than as glory seekers, mapping ground with their eyes and measuring distances with their breath. Engineers received their own cadre structure, with foremen responsible for gate rehanging, hinge repair, and the precise fitting of stone and timber in the resilient pattern that had become a Dacian signature. Decebalus turned what had been a toolkit into a doctrine. Intelligence moved from opportunistic rumor to organized practice. Traders who crossed between Moesia and the highlands were treated as information carriers. Their dues could be reduced if they reported accurately on garrison strengths, commanders' dispositions, and the tone of Roman edicts posted in market squares. Boatmen were questioned about river levels and patrol rhythms. Refugees and deserters were vetted, then either returned for diplomatic credit or absorbed into work crews and teaching roles. Decebalus valued knowledge more than bravado. He wanted timetables, not anecdotes. He wanted the names of Roman centurions who preferred negotiation, the locations where supply wagons bunched on bad ground, and the windows when river patrols thinned. Diplomacy beyond the Carpathians reflected the same precision. With Sarmatian groups on the plains, he favored compact agreements that exchanged grazing freedom or payments for clearly limited service. Too much dependence on steppe cavalry risked invitation to interference. Too little wasted a potential buffer. His policy sought a line between the two. He courted riders for specific campaigns or seasons, paid reliably, and dismissed them on schedule, signaling respect without surrender. To the east and northeast, where mixed communities with steppe ties watched Dacian movements with wary interest, he traded gifts for silence and passage, choosing quiet corridors over loud boasts. Inside the mountain core, he elevated Sarmizegetusa Regia from an important seat to an unquestioned capital. The change was not announced with fanfare. It was enforced by rhythm. Council days were held there by default. Levy tables were posted there first. Sanctuary audits of grain and metal were conducted there with a regularity that made imitation elsewhere look like delay. Legal formulas were standardized in the capital's voice. Captains traveling from outlying forts learned that a dispute unresolved in their valley would be judged at the central terraces unless settled quickly. Authority thus flowed downhill from a place rather than from a person alone, anchoring his rule in a geography that could outlast a reign. He also reorganized the economy for speed. Mines and salt works still delivered portions to public stores, but Decebalus changed how stores moved. He established relay points at intervals measured by a day's march, each with pre-built racks for amphorae and grain sacks, each with a roster of oxen to be kept ready during declared danger periods. When a fortress needed reinforcement or when a siege had to be sustained longer than planned, supplies traveled along this prepared spine. The state did not rely on emergency seizure that alienated households. It drew on reserves counted at sanctuaries, moved by quotas that communities already understood as part of their duty. Because the burdens were predictable, the people carried them without the resistance that accompanies improvised requisitions. A quiet but telling reform involved craftsmen. Decebalus drew metalworkers, carpenters, and stonecutters into semi-permanent teams attached to fortresses and to the capital's workshops. He offered them steady rations, protection from arbitrary levies, and the prestige of serving at the core. In return, they trained apprentices and met output targets that were expressed in standardized parts: hinges, clamps, spearheads, mail links, and the fittings needed for the distinctive Dacian gates and watch platforms. The result was an industrial rhythm. When a gate failed in a distant valley, the replacement pieces already matched. When a cohort needed a chest of spare mail rings, it arrived with the correct measures. All of this would have remained preparation without the political act that made it matter. Decebalus translated administrative muscle into decisive timing. He watched the South Bank and chose his moments when Roman attention wavered, when a governor was new, when legions rotated, or when imperial focus shifted to the east. He understood that the Danube was not a wall, but a road. If he could seize the right moment, he could strike, negotiate, and withdraw on terms favorable to his realm. That calculus required nerve and restraint. Nerve to act when most would counsel patience. Restraint to stop when the glow of a victory tempted allies to demand more. In the mountains, his presence reshaped elite expectations. Nobles who had been stewards under cautious kings discovered that under Decebalus promotion favored those who delivered results on schedule. The cultural currency of the court tilted from lineage talk to performance talk. A captain who kept his road segments repaired and his levy trained could speak freely. One who boasted of ancestral glory without meeting quotas found himself sidelined. Priests, far from losing influence, gained it through the predictable audits they conducted. Because Decebalus made punctuality a sacred matter, the men who kept the sacred clock held real power. The blend of piety and practicality was deliberate. It made loyalty a habit rather than a mood. Roman writers noticed the change. Reports reaching governors in Moesia spoke of a northern ruler who combined speed with caution. Raids and counter-raids became sharper, scouts more elusive, and fortress signals more disciplined. Patrols that once crossed the river to burn a village and return at leisure now found themselves shadowed by riders who refused battle on bad terms and melted into passes made unfriendly by fresh earthworks. When envoys came to parley, they met a court that understood Roman ranks and could quote prior undertakings without bluster. This was the mark of a ruler who treated information as a weapon and calendars as shields. Decebalus also invested in human capital in a way that earlier rulers had not fully systematized. He sought out veterans of sieges, whether local or foreign, and placed them as instructors in mixed units so that their knowledge propagated quickly. He selected promising young nobles for cross-posting among the ring of fortresses, preventing parochial habits and creating an officer class that thought of the Orishti system as a single organism. He rotated engineers between the capital and outlying works, ensuring that innovations, new bracing for gates, better drainage for terraces, improved cistern linings, spread without bottleneck. In this way, the kingdom learned as a whole rather than as isolated nodes. External messaging matched internal reality. When he wanted peace, he sent embassies loaded with practical proofs, returned deserters, escorted caravans, and detailed lists of stolen goods recovered after raids, all presented as evidence that he controlled his frontier. When he wanted space to maneuver, he allowed rumors of alliances to circulate, then let silence work on Roman nerves. His goal in both cases was the same: to be treated as a sovereign whose choices had to be courted, not as a bandit to be swatted. It did not always work, but it often bought time, and time is the coin of preparation. One sensitive thread in his ascent was the question of succession above him. Roman sources suggest that an elder ruler named Duras, also remembered as Diorpanius, yielded pride of place when the scale of the coming contest became clear. Whether this was a peaceful handover or a pressured accommodation, the effect was clean. Decebalus stepped into the role with a mandate that combined traditional sanction with the urgency of defense. He did not waste that mandate on pageantry. He called councils to post levy tables and repair schedules, then dismissed them to work. He visited forts quietly, spoke with captains without entourage, and rewarded units for punctual execution rather than for theatrical loyalty oaths. The final component in his rise was psychological. He taught his people to expect strain and to see endurance as victory. Garrisons drilled to hold passes for fixed spans, to absorb losses without panic, and to watch for the moment when an enemy supply line stretched thin. Civilians learned that declared danger periods would be honored by the state with rations and escorts, reducing the panic that can empty a countryside and choke a defensive plan. By naming hardships in advance and linking them to visible relief, he removed two of war's worst allies, surprise and rumor. The quiet balance along the Danube ended in the reign of the Emperor Domitian. A sequence of sharp blows and counterblows turned the river frontier into an active theater, and the passes at Tapai became the hinge on which fortunes swung. For the Dacians under Decebalus, this was the first full test of the system he had forged. Disciplined fortresses, drilled levies, precise logistics, and intelligence that treated the Danube as a road rather than a wall. For Rome, it was an early lesson that the opponent to the north could not be dismissed as a cluster of unruly tribes. Pressure began with Dacian probes that cut deeper than the routine skirmishes of earlier decades. The governor of Moesia, Appius Sabinus, moved to contain them and was killed in the fighting, a shock that told Rome the frontier had shifted from nuisance to threat. Domitian reacted by dividing the old province into two commands, an organizational response meant to sharpen control and speed decisions. At the same time, he hurried seasoned units toward the river and looked to his closest circle for a commander who could deliver quick results. Cornelius Fuscus, the Praetorian prefect, received the first major field command against Decebalus. His assignment was to regain the initiative, punish the northern kingdom, and restore the impression of Roman inevitability that steadied border allies. Fuscus chose speed. He pushed north across the river on the line of the great road that ran through the Banat and toward the Carpathian gate called Tapai. The plan mirrored Roman habits that had served well elsewhere. Move rapidly, force the passes before the enemy could gather, and aim a decisive thrust toward the highland seat. Decebalus answered with a blend of terrain reading and tactical restraint. He refused to spend his strength in the lowlands. Instead, he pulled Roman columns into the wooded approaches where the ground narrowed, sightlines shortened, and the rhythm of supply wagons could be disrupted. Earthworks and abatis appeared in the tree lines. Scouts managed the pace of contact so that Roman formations alternated between confidence and friction. When Fuscus reached the approaches to Tapai, he still believed momentum favored him. The Dacian counterstroke broke that belief. In fierce fighting that exploited the constricted ground, Dacian units cut into Roman lines and pressed them hard. Fuscus fell in the clash, and with him went men of the elite and the pride of a legion's eagle. The loss of the standard, taken by northern hands, sent a message heavier than any captured wagon. The consequences were immediate on both sides. In the Dacian mountains, the victory confirmed the value of Decebalus's program. Trained captains, rehearsed signals, and precise logistics could blunt and then reverse a Roman advance. The news strengthened his standing with nobles who measured rulers by results. On the Roman side, the shock forced a sober reassessment. A Praetorian prefect with the emperor's confidence had been defeated. A legionary eagle had been lost. To respond with haste alone would invite a second disaster. Rome needed a commander who understood northern terrain, would respect preparation, and could rebuild morale along the river. Tedius Julianus received that call. He took command with a different tempo from Fuscus, rebuilding the frontier's rhythm before reaching for the passes. Julianus strengthened depots, confirmed the reliability of ferry points, refreshed the chain of watch posts, and paid careful attention to intelligence from traders and scouts who knew the bends of the river and the difficult ground beyond. He examined the routes toward Tapai not as a single thrust, but as a series of staged positions, each with a clear plan for reinforcement and retreat. The goal was to deny Decebalus the kind of ambush conditions that had been crafted against Fuscus. Decebalus did not wait passively. He knew Rome would return with better preparation, and he set about complicating their task. In the approaches to the passes, he thickened obstacles, rehearsed withdrawal paths that could quickly be reversed into counterattacks, and stored supplies at depths that kept frontline garrisons light enough to move but not so lean that they were brittle. He also worked the political levers that earlier victories had unlocked, renewing compacts with riders from the plains and reminding neighboring groups that his court paid on time and guarded its allies' interests. Julianus advanced when the base work was done. His columns moved with discipline, reconnoitering thoroughly and keeping their supplies stretched but intact. When contact came near Tapai, it was not under a canopy of surprise, but as a grinding contest in which formation, endurance, and the ability to rotate fresh cohorts forward decided the day. Roman training reasserted itself. Units held under pressure, standards stayed upright, and the enemy's attempts to fracture the line were met with controlled counterpushes. The Dacians fought with the determination that had broken Fuscus, but the ground now favored neither side as completely. By the end of the battle, Julianus had the field. This reversal did not erase the earlier Roman defeat, and it did not shatter Dacian capacity. What it did was change the bargaining table. Decebalus had shown he could kill a Roman commander and capture an eagle. Rome had shown it could absorb the lesson, return with discipline, and win through preparation. Both sides had reason to pause. Domitian wanted the prestige of a settlement that looked like victory without committing the time and treasure a deep mountain war would demand. Decebalus wanted to convert his still strong position into recognition and breathing space for further strengthening. The treaty that followed reflected this mutual calculation. Rome recognized Decebalus as a king and agreed to provide annual subsidies and technical assistance. Roman engineers and specialists crossed the river not as conquerors, but as hired expertise, men who would help improve walls, water systems, and perhaps even siege engines under the watchful eyes of the court at Sarmizegetusa Regia. In return, Decebalus pledged to keep the peace along the frontier, to return deserters, and to respect certain spheres of influence. The symbolism was delicate. To Roman audiences, the settlement could be framed as a benevolent act toward a client ruler. To Dacian audiences, it communicated a different truth, that even Rome would pay to maintain quiet when faced with a capable and organized foe. This arrangement had far-reaching effects. The most obvious was the influx of knowledge. Engineers who had studied at legionary camps and served in sieges around the empire now worked on Dacian projects. Techniques for stabilizing terraces, improving gate bracing, and lining cisterns moved into the Orashti ring. The kingdom's own craftsmen absorbed these skills, adapted them to local materials and building traditions, and multiplied them across the fortified belt. In the short term, this made Dacian strongholds harder to reduce. In the longer term, it helped standardize repair methods and supply planning. The subsidies mattered as well. Regular payments allowed Decebalus to keep garrisons provisioned without leaning too heavily on seasonal exactions that could sour rural loyalty. They also funded the retention of specialists, metalworkers, carpenters, and sappers, whose value lay in continuity. A craft learned over years can be broken by a single hungry winter. Subsidy grains and coin prevented such breaks, ensuring that the kingdom's technical spine grew denser rather than thinner in the years after the treaty. Morale and perception shifted. Among Dacian nobles, the settlement validated the cautious aggressiveness that Decebalus had preached. He had fought Rome, killed a high official, resisted a disciplined counterattack, and then secured funds and expertise. Among Roman commanders, the settlement warned that campaigns north of the river would not be quick reputational wins. The opponent was organized, and even a favorable battle like the later fight at Tapai could end not with triumphal annexation, but with a bargain that required explanation to the Senate and to the legions. The frontier itself changed texture. With formal peace in place, traders moved with more confidence. Caravans passed frontier stations where oaths and receipts were exchanged according to formulas that both sides could accept. Dacian envoys traveled to Roman camps and towns as recognized agents of a king. Roman officers sent inspectors who crossed under safe conduct to verify that deserters were indeed being returned and that raids were not masked as private thefts. These routines built mutual knowledge. Each side learned the other's faces and habits, a familiarity that can soften suspicion but also sharpen future plans. Not every consequence served peace. The same intelligence that facilitated treaty compliance also filled notebooks. Roman officers noted the impressive progress at certain strongholds and the disciplined way in which Dacian captains met deadlines for repairs and muster. They reported on the rhythm of levy rotations, the likely store levels in public granaries, and the roads most used by royal couriers. Decebalus's envoys and scouts, for their part, observed the Danube bases more closely than ever, charting which depots were expanded, which bridges were repaired or reinforced, and which governors displayed the restless energy that portended future campaigns. Within the Dacian court, Decebalus continued the internal reforms that had brought him to power, now with greater resources. He deepened the practice of cross-posting officers among the ring of fortresses, amplified engineer training, and codified the logistical relay system so that every district could calculate its contribution to any declared emergency. He looked beyond immediate war measures to broader state tasks, improving roads that linked the Orishti core to allied valleys, settling border disputes quickly to keep labor focused on productive work, and reinforcing the message that punctual service would be repaid with public support in lean seasons. The habit of rule grew stronger because it spared households the corrosive uncertainty that drives evasion and revolt. Rome, for its part, could not forget the humiliation of a lost eagle or the political awkwardness of paying a northern king. Even as Domitian presented the settlement as a prudent achievement, the machinery of imperial planning turned. Roads along the Danube were improved, river flotillas refined their patrol schedules, and new officers were groomed with the frontier in mind. The legions that would later march under a different emperor were already learning from reports filed in these years. Accounts of Dacian ambush tactics, of the watchfire codes used in the mountains, of the strength and weakness of particular passes when heavy rain turned the ground to clinging mud. The net effect of Domitian's war was to harden both sides. The Dacian state emerged with more skill, better fortifications, and a confidence born of having fought Rome to a negotiated standstill. Rome emerged with a clearer picture of what conquest would require, not a punitive excursion, but a methodical, multi-year effort built on engineering, logistics, and relentless pressure. The river frontier thus became a chessboard on which both players had learned the value of preparation. The quiet that followed Domitian's settlement along the Danube was not a stable peace. It was a pause in which both sides recalculated. In Rome, a new kind of leader was coming to power, one who preferred measured preparation to theatrical threats. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known to us as Trajan, rose first as a trusted commander and then as emperor, and he treated the Dacian frontier not as a nuisance, but as a solvable strategic problem. This section follows how he turned a restless border into a theater tuned for a deliberate campaign. The transition began with repair at home. After Domitian's death, the elder Nerva inherited an uneasy capital and a suspicious army. To steady the state, he adopted Trajan, a general respected by the legions on the Rhine. Adoption gave Rome a successor with soldierly credibility and freed Trajan to act as a co-ruler who could impose discipline without drama. He did not hurry toward spectacle. He visited garrisons, listened to frontier officers, and began the patient work of aligning provincial logistics with imperial aims. When Nerva died and Trajan became sole emperor, the army already understood his habits. He would praise competence, punish waste, and plan in seasons, not days. On the Danube, he found conditions that offended Roman pride and threatened Roman security. The settlement granted to Decebalus under Domitian had stabilized the river, but it also set a precedent Rome disliked: subsidies to a powerful neighbor, engineers sent across as helpers rather than masters, and a frontier story that could not be told as simple victory. Reports from Moesia and Pannonia accused the northern king of sheltering deserters, recruiting foreign specialists, and strengthening fortresses in ways that made a second Roman humiliation less, not more, likely. Allies south of the river complained that raids masked as private ventures continued. The frontier ledger did not balance. Trajan's answer was to change the inputs, strengthen the bases, clarify lines of advance, and build a supply machine that could feed legions beyond the river for as long as needed. He began with roads. The gorges and narrows of the Iron Gates region had always constrained movement. Under his orders, rock faces were cut, ledges widened, and towpaths prepared so that the Danube fleet could be hauled or steered where current made upstream progress difficult. Milestones and dedicatory plaques, which later travelers would read with wonder, marked not vanity, but a timetable. Stretch by stretch, the river lane became a dependable artery for grain, timber, and men. Behind the river line, he mapped depots at intervals a marching column could trust. Each held grain, salted meat, amphorae of oil and wine, spare gear, and the tools engineers would need to turn a clearing into a defensible camp by nightfall. He insisted that quartermasters treat these stores as instruments of tempo. Columns would move because the next day's rations were already placed along the line, and boats would arrive on schedules that matched the foot pace of the infantry. Supply, in his plan, was not a support function. It was the metronome of the war. The fleet on the lower Danube, long present as a patrol force, grew into a logistic partner. Lighter craft scouted shoals and watched for sudden water level changes. Heavier transports staged near great crossing points. Crews rehearsed mixed convoys that paired troop carriers with supply barges and small escorts. Fleet officers met legion tribunes at marked landings to coordinate handoffs so that no column waited hungry on a bank or marched blindly into a bend where enemy scouts might watch. These practicalities matter because they reveal the shape of Trajan's thinking. No bold arrow thrust on a map, but a chain of small certainties linked into a path that an army could follow in winter or spring. He reconsidered the distribution of legions and auxiliaries along the frontier. Veteran formations in Pannonia and Moesia received extra engineers and carpenters. Fresh recruits were drilled by instructors who had fought in forests and hills, not only on flat parade grounds. The 1st Italica, the 2nd Adiutrix, the 5th Macedonica, and the 4th Flavia Felix, among others, appear in postings and later memorials tied to this buildup. More than their names, what matters is their composition. Trajan favored composite forces in which heavy infantry marched with a tailored mix of archers, slingers, and light cavalry raised from provincial peoples who knew river weather and mountain roads. He also pushed for protective kit adapted to Dacian weapons. Arm guards and reinforced helmets, once associated mainly with gladiatorial arenas and special detachments, were assessed for battlefield use against the curved blades that Dacian infantry wielded to hook shields and arms. Where tests showed value, procurement followed. Intelligence work deepened. Officers learned to budget silver not only for spies, but for weather reports and water data. Boatmen who kept careful notebooks on currents and eddies found patrons. Traders who crossed safely during calm weeks were asked to keep informal tallies of stores seen moving toward the mountain ring. Deserters who truly sought asylum were fewer than rumor claimed, but the handful that reached Roman lines were questioned methodically about repair schedules, levy rotations, and signal codes in the hills. Rome's aim was not mystery, but measurement. Trajan did not speak of unknown barbaricum. He kept lists. Which passes opened earliest after snowmelt, which valleys could sustain a siege train, which fords held in a sudden thaw. His staff mapped the Dacian heartland with unusual care. The Orashti ring, with Sarmizegetusa Regia at its core, could not be swallowed by one rush. It required isolation. That meant taking and holding the passes that linked the Banat to the interior and the valleys that carried water and supplies toward the capital. Scouts traced the beads of fortified sites, Kostesti, Blidaru, Piatraroshi, Banitsa, each a local problem and all together a system. The plan that took shape in headquarters was not to batter the capital first, but to cut the threads one by one, forcing defenders to choose between risking field battle or watching their network strangled. Politics in Rome worked alongside preparation on the Danube. The Senate, relieved to see a soldier emperor who treated them with respect, gave Trajan the legal cover he needed to act and the honors that made his future victory easier to narrate. Coinage began to show themes of restoration and frontier strength. Provincial elites along the river competed to host imperial visits and to fund monuments that, while pious in language, doubled as markers of military stages. None of this meant that the war was decided in advance. It meant the story would have a framework ready when the time came to tell it. Across the river, Decebalus read the signals. He had gained stature by winning and bargaining. He now faced a planner who was patient, steady, and willing to spend seasons on roads and depots before throwing dice in the passes. The Dacian king answered by knitting his own system tighter. He repeated the practices that had brought success under Domitian's shadow, rotating officers across the ring so that no fortress became a personal fief, auditing stores at sanctuaries to keep garrisons fed, and drilling cavalry screens to shadow Roman patrols without being lured into open ground. He also sought manpower insurance. Agreements with riders from the plains were refreshed. Gifts and payments secured promises for limited service in declared danger periods. In short, he did what a prudent ruler does when a larger neighbor grows methodical. He prepared to absorb blows without unraveling. The treaty's legal language, once a buffer, now became a battlefield of interpretation. Rome accused Dacia of harboring fugitives and rearming beyond the spirit of the pact. Dacia pointed to raids by border adventurers and to Roman governors who pushed skirmishes beyond agreed limits. Both hearts beat faster. On bad days, the frontier looked like it always had, a string of sharp fights and quick truces. On good days, it revealed the depth of investment both rulers were making. New Roman depots rose, new Dacian terraces hardened. Each side understood that the next war would not be a test of courage alone, but of endurance and repair. Trajan's personal tours along the river deserve emphasis because they reveal his method. He did not leave reconnaissance to subordinates. He walked embankments, watched ship drills, and paced the ground where roads would be cut. He spoke with centurions who had dug ditches in winter and asked them what wood held truest when frozen and wet. He listened to veterans who remembered where Fuscus had rushed and where Julianus had paused, and he incorporated those lessons into route choices and staging plans. The emperor's presence did more than inspire. It synchronized bureaucracy with reality, collapsing the distance between order and execution that often plagues large states. Within the legions, training shifted from show to function. Units rehearsed bridge cover, night camp construction on steep slopes, and relief of forward cohorts under missile fire in forests. Engineers pre-built modular components for ramps and towers that could be hauled on carts and reassembled near a hostile wall. Medical detachments stocked bandages and tools at the same depots that held grain, recognizing that quick treatment returns men to the line and saves supply in the long run. Blacksmiths traveled with marching columns, authorized to repair and refit on site rather than waiting for distant workshops. The army learned to behave like a construction guild that could fight, not only a fighting machine that occasionally built. One innovation with outsized effect was the insistence on redundancy. Trajan required alternative routes for convoys, backup fords, and auxiliary units trained to perform outside their specialty when needed. An archer cohort might practice as light infantry for holding a clearing. A cavalry turma might learn to dismantle and move a small bridge in a hurry. This cross-competence reduced the number of single points of failure that Decebalus's captains could target. It also kept morale calm when plans shifted, because units had already rehearsed the second and third options. The legal groundwork for war moved in parallel. Formal embassies laid out complaints. Deadlines were set and allowed to lapse. Messages were framed so that when Rome moved, it could claim necessity rather than appetite. Trajan did not relish the optics of greed, especially with an audience at home that prized the language of just war. He wanted the record to show that patience had limits, that subsidies had purchased no security, and that Roman dignity required more than guarded depots south of the river. The Senate's cooperation ensured that decrees and honors would align with the rhythm of the campaign once it began. By the time winter quarters settled before the opening of hostilities, the frontier had been transformed. Forts on the south bank were linked by roads that a wagon could trust in rain. Landings were graded and marked. Storehouses held measured rations sufficient for months, and a fleet accustomed to routine patrol now functioned as a river road crew and supply train. The legions had learned the feel of the ground, and their commanders carried maps based on new surveys rather than on inherited sketches. Scouts returned with notes that matched those maps. Quartermasters issued orders that matched the notes. The machine was tuned. For Decebalus, these months were a test of nerve. He wanted to preserve a freedom of action that had made earlier bargaining possible, yet he could not ignore the sober patience on the other bank. He oversaw repairs and winter drills, replaced captains who missed schedules, and reminded nobles that the kingdom's safety lay in coordinated response, not in private raids that gave Rome a pretext. He sent messages to neighboring groups to keep their commitments crisp and limited. He strengthened water systems in the ring of fortresses, knowing that Rome would try to cut supplies as much as batter walls. He rehearsed withdrawal and counterattack paths through the passes, timing how long it took units to shift from one position to another under load. He prepared the only rational way a smaller state can prepare against a larger one, by making every hour count and every store measure mean what it said. What distinguishes this build-up from the skirmishing of earlier decades is scale and intent. Rome was not merely protecting markets, it was preparing to dismantle a mountain system piece by piece. Dacia was not merely defending hilltops, it was readying a state to survive siege and to strike at moments of Roman overreach. The coming war would therefore be decided by engineering and administration as much as by courage. Bridges, roads, depots, and signal chains would matter as much as swords and spears. Each side had learned that lesson in the previous clashes. Each now tried to apply it more completely. When spring opened the river lanes, Rome put its careful preparations to the test. The Emperor Trajan moved his columns toward the Danube, not with a single dramatic crossing, but through a sequence of staged advances that matched the supply rhythm he had built in the preceding seasons. The objective was straightforward in statement and complex in execution. Break the outer ring of Dacian defenses, force the high passes, and compel Decebalus to accept terms that ended Roman subsidies while constraining his freedom of action. Everything that followed, the route choices, the sieges, the reliefs, the pauses, served that design. The initial crossings relied on pontoons and ferries escorted by the fleet. Roman engineers secured bridgeheads on the north bank where the current and shoreline allowed quick consolidation. Camps sprang up on pre-selected terraces. Ditches and ramparts grew by the hour. Supply barges nosed into flagged landings where quartermasters already knew the day's allotments. Auxiliaries from the river provinces screened the edges of these bridgeheads, probing for Dacian scouts and testing the local ground for how it held under weight. Trajan did not seek a reckless sprint inland. He wanted a living corridor along which grain and tools flowed as reliably as messages. Decebalus met this opening with elastic defense. Cavalry screens shadowed the Roman advance, testing flanks and retreating before concentrated counterpunches. Infantry detachments improved obstacles along the forested approaches, felling trees to narrow paths and shaping the ground to break Roman formation when the road bent or dipped. Watchfires signaled night movements between the outer forts, and runners carried news back to the Statecraft, where stores and reserves waited on the terraces of Sarmizegetusa Regia. The Dacian king's first aim was to slow Rome, draw it into the hills on unfavorable terms, and learn how the new emperor moved when the plan met friction. As the columns pressed inland from the Banat, the passes of Tapai again became the decisive corridor. Trajan did not underestimate them. He advanced in echelons, with strong vanguards feeling their way and robust reserves ready to exploit openings or cover setbacks. Light troops, archers and slingers drawn from provincial peoples used to rough ground, worked ahead of the heavy infantry to clear skirmishers and to secure knolls from which engineers could judge lines of approach. When contact grew close, standards remained steady and reliefs were executed by the book. Cohorts that had borne the brunt fell back behind fresh lines, and officers kept the intervals intact so that the Dacian hook blades could not pull men from their shields and ranks. The fighting in the Tapai approaches was bitter and personal. Dacian infantry, confident in the cut and reach of their curved blades, sought the edges of shield walls, while Roman soldiers, protected by reinforced guards and drilled against those very threats, answered with disciplined thrusts. Neither side found the quick collapse that commanders hoped for in the first shock. Progress came yard by yard. At last, Roman steadiness told. The Dacian line yielded ground in measured withdrawal rather than in rout, preserving strength for further resistance deeper in the hills. The passes were not a road to the capital. They were a threshold to a campaign of sieges and counter-sieges. Past Tapai, Trajan's methodical style remained visible. He left secure garrisons at critical junctions, fortified depots behind him, and pressed on toward the chain of strongholds that guarded the approaches to the Dacian heartland. Each site, whether overlooking a pass or commanding a valley mouth, posed a specific problem built from timber and stone and solved with time, sweat, and coordination. Roman engineers brought up rams and towers in sections, assembled them under cover, and advanced them behind mantlets. Sappers dug, listening for the telltale creak of Dacian countermines. Defenders answered with sorties, fire, and sudden lunges at the base of the machines. Siegecraft, learned over generations in Mediterranean cities, now wrestled with mountain fortifications designed to absorb shock and to deny clean ground for heavy engines. Decebalus refused to be fixed to any one wall. When a stronghold faced encirclement, he used smoke and night movements to withdraw garrisons before the ring closed, preserving the cadre that gave the fort its value. When Roman camps looked overextended, he tested them with converging attacks, counting on the terrain to muddle reliefs. He also brought allied riders from the plains for short, concentrated service, using them to harry Roman convoys at the edge of the forest belt, where a toppled cart could block a narrow way and turn a mile of supply into an hour of vulnerability. These tactics did not reverse the Roman advance, but they forced Trajan to spend the coin of time at a higher rate than any simple map arrow would suggest. As summer deepened, a pattern emerged. Rome took ground and left skeletonized strongholds behind it, their crews reduced, their stores drawn down, their role now to watch and report. The Dacian court shifted men along interior lines, backfilling threatened corridors and staging counterattacks where Roman lines stretched between a siege and its nearest supply base. When one fort fell, another fortified terrace a ridge away replaced it as the hinge of defense. No single victory gave Trajan the path he wanted. The accumulation of victories made that path more visible. One of the campaign's telling moments came during the attempt to isolate key nodes in the Orasti system. Roman forces moved to choke the water routes and paths that fed the inner ring. Decebalus countered by launching an attack aimed at Roman convoys and rear area camps, hoping to compel a pause and to shake the illusion that the invaders could choose all the terms. The clash, hard-fought and costly, confirmed two truths. First, Dacian units still had the cohesion to strike at organized Roman forces outside walls, not just to defend from behind ramparts. Second, the Roman legions, trained through the build-up for relief under pressure, could pivot from siege posture to open-field defense and then back again without dissolving into confusion. After this test, both sides returned to their themes, Trajan to siegecraft, Decebalus to maneuver within the system, but with sharpened respect. Weather began to matter. Rains turned some approaches into clinging mud and swelled streams that engineers had counted on bridging quickly. Roman road gangs cut drains and laid fascines where they could. Dacian captains chose their spoiling attacks for days when footing favored men who knew the ground by heart. Periods of fog let couriers slip through lines that would have been sealed under clear skies. Trajan, wary of overreach, resisted the temptation to drive all the way into the capital zone before the season turned. He had made his point. The outer ring could be penetrated, the passes could be held, and the Dacian defensive system could be forced to spend from its reserves at an alarming rate. A pause, if it brought a negotiation on Roman terms, would count as success. Negotiations did open, backed by the knowledge that both armies still had fights left in them. As envoys moved, Trajan imposed conditions that aimed to convert battlefield gains into strategic leverage. He demanded the surrender of captured Roman equipment, the return of deserters, the cession or neutralization of certain strongholds that threatened the new Roman positions, and the dismantling of resources that had enabled the quick rebuilding of Dacian defenses. He also sought hostages of rank who would anchor Dacian promises to Roman patience. Decebalus, reading his own ledger, calculated what he could concede without giving away the core. Independence mattered. The integrity of the Oresti system mattered. The ability to rearm quietly in the next winter mattered most of all. The terms accepted at the close of this first campaign reflected these competing priorities. Decebalus kept his throne and the sovereignty of his state, while agreeing to constraints that, on paper, narrowed his options. Certain fortresses were to be dismantled or handed over. Weapons seized from Roman defeats in earlier years were to be returned. Deserters were to be handed back, and Dacian diplomacy, beyond agreed spheres, was to be curbed. Subsidies that had once flowed north ceased, at least formally. To Rome's public, this settlement could be presented as restoration. The frontier's dignity affirmed, the enemy humbled, the legions vindicated. Inside Dacia, the settlement read differently. Decebalus had taken losses and could not deny them, yet he had also preserved the essentials. The capital remained free. The priestly courts continued to count stores on their terraces. The levy calendar still synchronized the valleys, and the officer corps remained intact. Moreover, the pause promised time. Time to repair terraces, to replace fittings on gates and ladders, to rest garrisons, to rotate engineers back to workshops where improvements sketched during the sieges could be turned into stronger hardware. The court treated the treaty not as surrender, but as a breathing space purchased at high cost. Cause and effect soon became visible. Roman garrisons left to hold forward positions worked to proof their camps against raids and to keep roads open through the wet season. Their presence reduced Dacian freedom of movement near the Banat, but it did not extinguish it deeper in the hills. Dacian captains used familiar corridors to move men and materials under cover. Blacksmiths and carpenters, whose teams Decebalus had cultivated with steady rations and predictable obligations, took stock of what had failed under Roman pressure and made adjustments. Stronger clamps for door frames, better drains for terraces, alternate channels to protect cisterns from being cut. The psychological balance in both camps remained complex. Roman officers could point to seized ground and terms imposed. Veterans could tell stories of careful leadership that spared lives by avoiding reckless charges. Yet the emperor had not paraded through a fallen Sarmizegetusa Regia, and everyone understood that as long as the Dacian capital stood, the war's logic would pull Rome north again. Dacian nobles, for their part, could take pride in having fought the greatest empire of their age to a negotiated pause while preserving independence. They also knew that the legions across the river had learned the road into the mountains and would return with that knowledge polished. In the months after the treaty, Decebalus moved to exploit every ambiguity left in the terms. He welcomed refugees and experts whose skills could be recast as civilian work. He strengthened alliances with riders who could be called in declared emergencies. He tested Roman patience along sectors where blame for a skirmish could be blurred. None of this was a rush to open war. It was reconnaissance by policy, a search for the limits of what Rome would tolerate under the treaty's language and what Dacia could rebuild without inviting an immediate storm. For Trajan, the pause proved his thesis as well. The legions could reach the passes under his new system. They could win set-piece fights against Decebalus's best infantry. They could sustain sieges in mountain weather. What remained was to remove the enabling conditions that had let Dacia fight, retreat, recover, and return to the field. That meant cutting the Orishti network away from its tributaries, battering it not just at the edges but at the arteries, and denying the capital those water and supply systems that gave defenders the courage to hold out. Engineering, already the heart of the Roman plan, would need to be used at a still higher pitch. The treaty that closed the first campaign was built to restrain a rivalry, not to resolve it. Once the armies stood down, both courts tested what the clauses would bear. The logic was simple on each side. Rome had demonstrated that its new engine of roads, depots, and river logistics could pry open the mountain belt. Decebalus had demonstrated that disciplined defense, agile withdrawals, and a resilient officer corps could keep the capital free. The paper peace that followed did not change the ledger of interests. It only changed the methods by which each actor pursued them. Decebalus moved first because he had more to repair. The inner ring of strongholds needed hardware and hands. Fortresses whose gates had groaned under Roman rams were refitted with thicker clamps and deeper housings. Cisterns whose feeds had been compromised were given second channels and stone linings that resisted tampering. Workshops at the capital and its satellite sites set quotas in the language of parts, not projects. So many hinges, so many mail links, so many spearheads bundled by count. Rotations of craftsmen continued through the winter so that no site sat idle. These were not the grand gestures a bard might celebrate. They were the steady increments that turned survival into readiness. The workforce came from sources that the treaty did not clearly forbid. Refugees from the South Bank, laborers, deserters, and a few technicians found places in these teams. Formal clauses required the return of fugitives, but the market for skill is hard to police. Men who claimed civilian status, or who presented themselves as artisans rather than soldiers, could be absorbed under local oaths. Decebalus's ministers covered these enrollments in the language of ordinary economy. A carpenter hired for beams, a smith for clamps, a stonecutter for stair treads. Rome protested the harboring of deserters. Dacian envoys replied that workmen were not legionaries and that frontier order was best served by keeping hungry men employed and supervised. Each complaint and reply measured the treaty's elasticity. Money and material flowed through channels that peace made easier to disguise. Traders arriving from the coastal towns brought amphorae and small wares as always, but careful buyers at the capital had other priorities. Iron billets, tool steel, nails by the sack, pitch for waterproofing, and cordage for hoists and ladders moved inland under the cover of routine commerce. Payments were punctual, and escorts were provided during declared danger periods. The signal to merchants was unmistakable. The Dacian court was a dependable client again, and predictable clients create longer caravans. The frontier warmed by degrees. Small Roman patrols reported harrying fire from unlikely distances, a sign that archers were practicing at ranges matched to the clearings along the roads. Watch posts saw Dacian scouts more often at dawn and dusk, as if rehearsing relief under pressure. Minor forts along the outer approaches were found repaired sooner than expected after winter storms. None of these observations, taken alone, proved violation. Together, they convinced Roman officers that the king was spending the pause on careful rearmament. Decebalus also repaired his diplomatic scaffolding. Agreements with riders on the plains whose short-term service had been decisive in spoiling Roman convoys during the first campaign were renewed in concise terms. This many days of service during declared emergencies, this many mounts kept ready near a cluster of known rendezvous points, this scale of gifts upon arrival and departure. These contracts emphasized punctual dismissal as well as prompt pay, a signal that the king would not invite interference by letting mercenary commitments drift into occupation. He needed cavalry that came when called, left on time, and did not devour the countryside in between. On the south bank, Roman commanders practiced a different patience. Reports were collated in provincial headquarters, lists of deserters not returned, descriptions of new bracing on familiar gates, sketches of fresh drainage lines on certain terraces, and notes from informants about the number of carts counted on the roads that linked the inner ring to outlying valleys. A case file grew, intended not merely for military planning, but for legal framing. Trajan wanted the story to read as a long record of broken obligations rather than as an emperor's appetite for conquest. That narrative required specifics. Governors in Moesia and Pannonia were instructed to record incidents in the careful prose that would survive debate in Rome. As the lists lengthened, the theater of embassy took center stage. Dacian envoys crossed the river with gifts and explanations. They brought back deserters of low rank while pleading ignorance about those whose skills the court preferred to keep. They explained border fights as the work of hotheads and promised compensations on market days. Roman legates listened, filed acknowledgments, and asked for names. The tone remained civil, but beneath the civility, the lines hardened. Each meeting taught both sides what the other would tolerate and what it would quietly absorb in the name of avoiding an immediate rupture. Even as this dance continued, one episode shattered the pretense of routine. A Roman officer of rank, remembered in later accounts as Longinus, fell into Dacian hands. Decebalus understood the value of a high-profile prisoner in a contest fought through letters as much as through lances. He sought to use the captive as leverage for better terms, or at least as a delay against Roman preparations. The attempt failed dramatically. The prisoner chose death rather than serve as a pawn, an act that robbed the king of a bargaining chip and provided Rome with a symbol of resolve. The incident tightened minds in both camps. In Rome, it stiffened the case that the treaty could not be salvaged. In the mountains, it reminded the court that the opponent was willing to pay dearly to keep its narrative clean. Skirmishes along the frontier sharpened, no longer mere raids but tests of response time. Dacian detachments probed auxiliary outposts and supply lines just long enough to force the dispatch of reliefs, then melted away to count how quickly and by which roads reinforcements arrived. Roman commanders answered with patrol patterns designed to confound these measures, varying times and routes, and pushing mixed columns forward to avoid predictable weaknesses. This was reconnaissance by attrition. Each side used friction to take the temperature of the other's readiness. Public stories reflected private conclusions. In Rome, coins appeared that celebrated the emperor's vigilance and the restoration of order along the frontiers, a hint to citizens and soldiers alike that a principled assertion of Roman dignity was underway. In the Dacian capital, councils continued to be held at sanctuaries with a message that fused piety and preparedness. Obligations would be audited, repairs would be finished on festival deadlines, and declared danger periods would bring ration guarantees for laborers and households who were devoting their strongest hands to public works. The state's promise to its people, service met with support, was renewed in simple forms that bred loyalty. Meanwhile, the river changed. Where the first campaign had depended on pontoons and staged ferries, Roman surveyors now marked broader ambitions. Engineers measured banks at places chosen not for a single crossing, but for a permanent structure. Trajan's closest technical advisor, the architect Apollodorus of Damascus, reviewed drafts and argued for spans and piers suited to the Danube's winter ice and spring surge. These consultations were not secrets. A project of that kind cannot be hidden from boatmen and fishermen. Word reached the north that Rome contemplated a bridge unlike any seen on that frontier. Decebalus had to decide how to read the rumor, as a bluff to extract concessions or as a promise that an unblinking campaign would soon step off. He chose to assume the latter and increased the tempo of measures that could complicate a second invasion. Outlying forts received orders to double their stores and to prepare covered ways for garrison movements during siege. Engineers rehearsed cutting and disguising water feeds so that a fortress could switch to a second channel if the first were compromised. Cavalry captains marked killing grounds where a convoy could be attacked within a short ride of a Roman camp, maximizing pressure while minimizing exposure. Specialists reviewed equipment used by Rome in the earlier campaign and made countermeasures: thicker mantlets where darts had pierced too easily, extra struts on ladders where impacts had split timbers, and smoke pots prepared for sorties intended to blind watchers on towers. Decebalus also courted expertise aggressively. Men with knowledge of Roman drill and kit were valuable, whether native to the mountains or imported under ambiguous circumstances. Some came openly, hired as builders or smiths. Others arrived as refugees whose stories did not match their calices. The court made room for them in workshops and teaching posts. The intent was not to imitate Rome in parade ground matters, but to translate Roman methods into mountain conditions. How to absorb a ram's blows without losing gait alignment. How to time sally ports so that returning fighters did not jam each other in narrow passages. How to rotate men on wall duty to keep eyes sharp through long watches. The program was practical, unsentimental, and effective. Rome read the same signs and drew the same conclusion. The treaty had become a screen for preparation. Trajan did not rush his answer. He let the record of incidents and evasions accumulate until even cautious senators would accept that patience had limits. He instructed provincial commanders to keep their own provocations to a minimum. He wanted the moral geometry of the situation to present clean angles when he moved. He also finished the last elements of his logistical grid. Roads hardened against spring mud, landings widened, reserve depots filled to the rafters with ration sacks labeled by day and destination. The army was ready to march and ready to eat while marching. Tension spread into the spaces between soldiers and civilians. Market towns on the south bank saw fewer Dacian buyers. Wagoners for hire raised their prices, counting risk into their contracts. Coastal merchants played a waiting game, selling to both sides while avoiding cargoes that might be deemed contraband by an angry governor. In the highlands, households tightened belts by choice, not yet on command, storing more grain than a normal year required. The court's clerks recognized these signs as proof that state messages had landed. People expected strain and were preparing to share it. Into this mood came the last provocations that erased ambiguity. Roman patrols reported organized attacks that could not be dismissed as private theft. Envoys sent north returned with answers that dodged more than they addressed, and one or two forts south of the river suffered coordinated night assaults that felt like rehearsals for deeper strikes. None of these incidents crippled the frontier. All of them clarified the next step. Trajan's council in the capital aligned law, story, and plan. The empire would move not as a hothead, but as a physician who had exhausted milder cures. North of the river, Decebalus held his own council and came to a mirror conclusion. If Rome intended to throw a bridge across the Danube and to press with more men and machines than any frontier war had yet seen, then the kingdom must fight on a rhythm that denied the enemy a single decisive blow. Garrisons would hold until ordered to slip away. Cavalry would spoil without seeking glory. Engineers would be as prized as champions. The levy calendar was rechecked and reaffirmed. Oath rituals were conducted not as theater, but as labor contracts sealed before the gods. The state would demand much. In return, it would keep its promises of rations, escorts, and restitution for those who served the longest under siege. The treaty's breathing space ended when Rome decided to replace ferries and pontoons with permanence. The crossing would no longer be a maneuver timed to a favorable week. It would become a standing fact. Trajan's architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, turned that idea into timber, iron, and stone. The bridge rose near Drobeta, where the current runs fast, but the banks offer firm purchase. Its design joined heavy masonry piers anchored in the riverbed to a superstructure of timber that could be repaired in sections. The effect was both practical and psychological. Practically, Rome could feed and rotate entire armies across seasons, not just days. Psychologically, the message to Decebalus and to every river community was blunt. The empire intended to stay. Construction itself was a campaign. Surveyors sounded the channel and marked a line where the footing would hold. Divers, trained for river work, guided cofferdams into place so that piers could be raised in the dry. Work crews cut and dressed stone upriver, then rafted it down to the site, while carpenters framed the lattice that would carry the roadway on top. The fleet became a floating scaffolding yard. Engineers synchronized deliveries to the rhythm of the Danube's moods, pushing hard when levels steadied, pausing when the current grew treacherous. Soldiers protected the site with riverside forts and patrols that denied saboteurs even a dusk-time approach. As each new pier rose above the water, the future became visible in increments. When the last span joined the far bank, the Danube ceased to be a bargaining chip and became an imperial avenue. Trajan moved the legions as soon as the corridor was secure. This time he did not frame the campaign as a thrust to test a pass. He framed it as a method to unweave a mountain system. Columns crossed in disciplined sequence, heavy infantry followed by mixed auxilia and engineer trains, with cavalry fanned out along both banks to suppress harassment. The first objective was not a headline fortress, but the road net that fed the fortified ring. Roman units seized junctions, cut side valleys with fieldworks, and garrisoned nodes that would let them pinch the Oresti approaches from multiple angles. Each step narrowed Decebalus's options without forcing him into a single decisive fight on open ground, which he would have rejected. Decebalus answered with a plan as elastic as the ground allowed. He refused to defend every approach and focused instead on making Rome pay in time. Outlying forts fell back from their forward terraces to closer circuits. Garrisons slipped out under night smoke when encirclement threatened. Cavalry kept to the edges of Roman lines, striking where convoys strung out on narrow shelf roads. When pressure eased, work parties returned to repair damage in hours, not weeks. He understood that the bridge had changed logistics. He sought to change tempo in return. Trajan's army adapted by making each captured ridge a factory. Engineers set up saw pits and forges within earshot of the picket lines, turning felled trees into mantlets, ladders, and fascines as fast as the infantry cleared space. The siege train that had once been hauled whole now self-replicated in the field. Medical detachments and smiths worked from the same depots that issued grain. Units practiced rotating from siege stance to convoy cover and back again, a shuffle learned during the first campaign but executed now at an accelerated pace. The army behaved like a chain of traveling workshops that could fight. The first major sieges of the second campaign tried out this machine. Fortresses on the arc that guards the Oresti core faced rams and towers brought forward in modular sections and assembled within timber screens. Sappers dug in teams, listening through poles pressed to the earth for the thud of enemy countermines. Dacian defenders replied with sudden sorties, firepots, and the famous curved blades used to hook shield rims and arms over parapets. What had changed since the earlier war was not courage, but endurance. Roman formations absorbed shocks and returned to rhythm. Dacian garrisons fell back to inner lines more often than before, preferring cohesion to last stands. Diplomacy did not stop when engines moved. Envoys still traveled, and offers still traveled with them. Trajan's messages promised recognition and safety to communities that opened their gates and gave hostages. Decebalus's messages promised relief and payment to those that held. Some hill commanders judged which side would reach them first and chose accordingly. The consequence was a patchwork of capitulations and stubborn fights that forced Rome to treat each stronghold as a separate equation. Trajan tolerated this inefficiency because it served the larger aim: to isolate the capital zone by removing its belt of ready allies, not merely to stack victories for the annals. The Oresti ring began to feel the tightening. Sites such as Kostest and Blidaru, once the eyes and fists of the system, found their lines of communication pressed. When a fortress lost quick access to slopeside water, it had to rely on cisterns whose feeds were now perilous to expose. Roman engineers made that vulnerability a principle. They targeted water and movement more than walls. A stronghold cut from its springs and from its nearest friendly ridge was a problem already half solved. Night movements that once refreshed a garrison now ran into pickets and shallow fieldworks on ridgelines that had been left unguarded in earlier wars. The ground itself seemed to tilt toward Rome, because Rome had made it tilt by controlling the ways men and water traveled. The Dacian court answered by shifting to counter-siege as policy. Decebalus gathered his best cadres and struck at Roman rear areas while the main columns pressed a wall. These blows aimed not to annihilate a legion, but to force a strategic pause by threatening its belly. Wagons burned, small depots were sacked. A bridge of convenience over a mountain torrent vanished in a night of axes. The hope was that Trajan would pull back to protect his lifelines, giving the ring space to breathe and repair. Rome's answer was redundancy. Secondary roads, alternative fords, and reserve convoys stood ready to take the strain when a slash landed. Auxiliaries schooled in woodland fighting learned to hunt raiding bands like quarry. The campaign became a duel between a state that could replace broken parts and a state that could break many parts at once. News from the plains complicated the picture. Some riders honored their compacts with Decebalus and arrived for declared emergency service. Others hesitated under Roman pressure or accepted Roman inducements to stand aside. The king's system still functioned, but the bridge had shortened Rome's patience and lengthened its reach. With columns supplied across seasons, Trajan could turn and return to threatened corridors without postponing the main effort. The empire's advantage, long latent, had become kinetic. A moment of high consequence came when the Romans pushed deep enough to threaten the waterworks that fed the capital zone. Dacian engineers had hidden channels and duplicated feeds after the First War, but Rome's sappers had studied the logic of those improvements. They now looked for the telltale curves of diverted streams and the faint sag in ground where a covered conduit ran. When they found a line, they worked like thieves and physicians, quietly, precisely, and with tools made for this single task. A fortress whose cisterns slowed to a trickle fought just as bravely as before, but its calculus changed. Sorties became costly, sorties became fewer. The day approached when a council would have to choose between a desperate break or a negotiated exit. Decebalus did not wait passively for that day. He countered with moves aimed at the one Roman asset he could not match, the person of the emperor. Rumors spread of attempted assassins and of envoys who mixed gifts with probes for the emperor's habits. Whether every tale is accurate is less important than the strategic point. The king recognized that Trajan's method was a mind as much as a map. If the mind could be spooked or removed, the machine might falter. The attempts failed, and the failure hardened Roman hearts. From that point, magnanimity toward outlying communities remained, but patience toward the royal court thinned. Mid-campaign weather threw its weight into the scales. Rains swelled the creeks. Fog cloaked slopes that scouts had learned to read by sky as much as by tree. Roman officers slowed rather than stumble into an ambush. Dacian captains used the pause to move men through corridors that, on clear days, would have been watched. In this breathing space, Decebalus launched a counterstroke that snapped at Roman nerves. A sudden, well-timed attack on multiple depots that briefly outpaced auxiliary screens. Fires lit the night in more than one valley. Couriers raced. Cohorts pivoted from siege to pursuit in hours. The damage proved repairable, but the lesson stuck. A siege train must never forget it is hunted. Trajan responded with tighter staging. He shortened the leash between his forward camps and their feeders, concentrated convoys under heavier guard, and posted more archers and slingers on the flanks of marching columns to spoil ambushes before they matured. He also moved to punish one or two strongholds whose commanders had exulted too openly in the raiding success. Demonstrations of Roman reach, executed quickly and publicly, reminded border communities that bargain and defiance had unequal costs. The emperor was still willing to accept a gate opened and a hostage offered, but less willing than before to tolerate a garrison that played both sides. Alongside iron and fire, words kept working. Trajan's proclamations promised security to districts that dissociated themselves from the royal court. He framed the war as one against a ruler who had broken faith, not against a people whose courage he acknowledged. Decebalus countered with the language of honor and survival, urging communities to see the imperial message as a wedge meant to split neighbors. Both narratives found listeners, but the material pressure kept mounting in one direction. Each time Rome tightened a noose around a water source or road knot, another hill community had to decide whether to keep faith or to keep food. Over time, hunger makes eloquent arguments. The military map by now showed a pattern of Roman salients reaching toward the capital. These salients were not reckless spears. They were buttressed by fortified camps, linked by roads hacked into slopes, and kept alive by the bridge that had turned the Danube into a Roman street. The Dacian ring still pulsed, but its beats came slower and with longer gaps between reliefs. Officers who had once rotated through multiple fortresses now found themselves fixed to a single wall for season after season. Craftsmen repaired and re-repaired the same gates. Clerks counted dwindling stocks with a seriousness that left no space for rhetoric. At court, Decebalus confronted the arithmetic of delay. He could still sting, he could still break a convoy and light a depot. He could not reverse the slow constriction that cut water, movement, and confidence. He called councils and asked for endurance. He offered sacrifices at the sanctuaries and bound captains by oaths that had sustained the system through earlier storms. Yet he knew that oaths and courage cannot fill a cistern. The question looming over the terraces was not whether to fight. That had been answered long ago. But how to fight when every path looked like a trap laid to force one terrible choice: stand and starve, or run and be chased. Rome, for its part, recognized that the outer ring's breadth had shortened. Trajan pushed detachments to seize ridge after ridge that overlooked the last reliable approaches to the capital. Engineers widened mountain paths into roads a wagon could trust even in rain, allowing rams and towers to appear where no earlier army had brought them. Auxiliary cohorts, accustomed now to forest and fog, provided the perpetual motion that kept Dacian raiders from resting. The machine that Apollodorus's bridge had enabled was doing what it had been built to do: sustain patient pressure until a fixed point cracked. The second campaign reached its decisive phase when Roman detachments stood within striking distance of the terraces that formed Sarmizegetusa Regia, the Dacian capital in the Orashtie highlands. Everything that had come before, the bridge over the Danube, the staged roadworks, the attrition of the outer ring, the contests for water and movement, had been preparation for this moment. The Dacian king had built a system meant to bend and recover. The Romans had engineered an army meant to tighten pressure without pause. The end, therefore, turned on logistics made visible. Who could keep men fed, walls intact, and water flowing? Trajan advanced with the same mixture of caution and persistence that had marked his earlier moves. Rather than throw all strength at the capital at once, he gripped the surrounding ridges and passes, securing approach routes and placing camps in depth so that reliefs could move without fear of being cut off. Engineers widened shelf roads to admit heavy engines, stacked timber for mantlets and towers, and marked sites for rams where the slope allowed their heads to swing true. Auxiliary cohorts, archers from the east, slingers from the islands, and light infantry from the Danubian provinces, screened the work and punished sorties that threatened to disrupt it. The legions most often linked to this effort, the 13th Gemina and the 4th Flavia Felix among others, brought to the hills a discipline that had been drilled for precisely such ground. Inside the capital zone, Decebalus convened councils in sanctuaries that had long doubled as courts and granaries. The calculations were plain. Stores had been husbanded, cisterns had been improved after the First War. The officer corps was intact. Yet the Roman method targeted lifelines, not only walls. Scouts reported enemy sappers probing the slopes for covered conduits. Watchmen noted fieldworks appearing on ridges that commanded the last reliable approach paths to outlying terraces. The king chose to hold. He believed that a measured defense could cost Rome weeks, perhaps enough to draw out diplomatic paths that would leave the core standing. The siege opened on multiple fronts. Roman engineers threw up lines of contravallation to blunt sorties and lines of circumvallation to deter relief from the hinterland. Towers rose where the earth took their weight. Rams moved forward behind mantlets, their heads wrapped in rawhide wet against fire. Sappers dug toward walls with the patient craft learned from eastern cities, listening through poles pressed to the ground for the thump and rasp of Dacian countermines. The defenders answered with the skills that had kept them independent. Sudden lunges through sally ports, smoke pots lobbed to blind the tower tops, curved blades striking at shield rims and arm guards whenever a formation wavered on broken slope. Decebalus sought to stretch Roman lines by forcing them to defend their own lifelines. Cavalry units slipped along interior tracks to strike at depots and bridges in the rear of the besiegers, betting that Trajan would recall cohorts to protect the belly of the machine. The emperor's answer was the same redundancy that had carried his armies this far. Secondary roads absorbed traffic when a span went down. Reserve convoys replaced burned wagons within days. Auxiliary screens learned to shadow raiders without overcommitting. The counterstrokes forced adjustments, but they did not change the direction of the siege. Roman camps in depth allowed pressure to remain steady while repairs were made behind the lines. The turning point came not from a breach blasted through a wall, but from water silenced in a channel. Roman scouts, guided by the logic of the slope and by the habits of Dacian engineering observed in earlier fortresses, located a covered conduit that fed part of the capital's water system. Sappers worked as quietly as they could, digging in small teams, shoring their tunnels with pre-cut timber, and using tools wrapped to muffle sound. When the channel was reached, the flow was cut or diverted. The effect rippled through the terraces. Cisterns that had been carefully topped off before the siege no longer filled at night. Rationing tightened. Sorties became more expensive in sweat and morale, because every man who left the walls drank from a store that could no longer be replenished easily. Roman commanders pressed the advantage. Assaults probed for weak sections while batteries of engines kept defenders pinned. Dacian officers responded with discipline, pulling men from exposed stretches to reinforce the threatened points and moving along covered ways that their engineers had mapped for just this purpose. Yet each day of dry troughs and slow cistern clocks shortened choices. The capital could still strike. It could no longer surge. Trajan added psychological pressure to material strain. He sent messages to key commanders on the terraces promising safety for garrisons and families if gates were opened and hostages given. He framed the offer as a distinction between the king, whom he accused of bad faith in treaty days, and the people, whose courage he praised and whose labor he claimed to respect. Decebalus countered with the language of oath and honor, calling on captains to remember the sanctuary's judgments and the long seasons of disciplined service that had made the state possible. For a time, loyalty held as law and memory demanded. Then, a breach opened. Accounts differ on which terrace yielded first, but the practical sequence is clear. A section of the outer defenses gave way under sustained pressure. Romans poured through into a zone where workshops and stores lay. Dacian commanders executed a planned withdrawal toward inner circuits, burning what they could not carry and trying to contain the invaders within the pocket they had taken. Fighting in the lanes was close and bitter. Roman cohorts, trained to reform in constricted spaces, pushed with shields and short thrusts. Defenders used every corner and height advantage to slow them. The breach did not topple the capital in a day, but it cracked the pattern that had kept the defense coherent. Amid this strain, the search for royal stores and state records intensified. Prisoners taken in the fighting were questioned for the whereabouts of treasure and for the paths by which sensitive archives might be slipped away. One name preserved in later narratives, Basilis, emerges here as a figure who revealed where the king's reserves had been hidden. According to the tradition, the treasure had been concealed in a riverbed after the stream's course was diverted and then restored to cover the hoard. If the story captures the essence, it underscores the king's practical cast of mind, use of terrain to hide the means of recovery. Under interrogation, the secret became Roman knowledge. Search parties reopened the channel, and a part of the royal wealth passed into imperial hands. The loss was financial. It was also symbolic. Stores that might have funded renewed defense or purchased peace had been turned into trophies. Decebalus read the ledger with clear eyes. The capital's lifelines were compromised. The enemy had reserves enough to keep pressure even when stung. The court's savings were exposed. He chose to slip the ring rather than wait to be paraded as a captive. With a cadre of trusted companions, He left the capital by tracks that Dacian engineers had maintained for just such a contingency, aiming to reach allies and terrain where Roman cavalry would find pursuit costly. The hope was to preserve a nucleus of leadership that could reconstitute resistance away from the collapsing center. Trajan anticipated the attempt and unleashed fast detachments to hunt. Among the officers who earned mention in later commemorations was Tiberius Claudius Maximus, a cavalryman who had already marked himself in earlier actions. Pursuit units followed sign and rumor, reading broken brush and village whispers, trusting scouts who had learned the shape of Decebalus's preferred ground. The chase ended when the king saw that capture was near. Refusing to be displayed in a Roman triumph, he took his own life. The deed was not theatrics, but a calculation about political consequences. A living king in chains would anchor Roman claims of total submission. A dead king denied the enemy that image. For Dacians, the act removed a focal point. For Romans, it removed a spectacle they would have preferred but did not need to decide the war. With the king gone, the defense of the capital lost coherence. Remaining terraces fell in sequence, some after short fights, others after bargains in which garrisons surrendered in exchange for safety. Roman units secured the sanctuaries, the workshops, and the administrative platforms that had fused law, ritual, and logistics in calmer years. Fires burned where fighting had been thickest. Smoke rose from stores that defenders had tried to deny the invaders. Yet the taking of Sarmizegetusa Regia was not only an event of flame and steel, it was also an administrative pivot. Clerks tallied what could be tallied. Engineers marked which structures could be reused or repurposed. Officers listed men and families under guard, arranging for dispersal or settlement according to orders that would soon formalize a new provincial map. Trajan took care to fold the evidence of victory into a narrative that would travel. Letters to the Senate, inscriptions at frontier sites, and, eventually, the sculpted frieze that spiraled up the column in the new forum at Rome presented the siege and the death in a language of order restored. The emphasis fell on engineering and perseverance as much as on combat. Bridges built, roads cut, water lines seized, walls taken, and on the finality that a dead enemy ruler seemed to guarantee. The message to Rome's allies and clients was equally clear. The empire would spend seasons and treasure to remove a threat that refused settlement. It would then institutionalize the result. In the highlands, the aftermath mixed quiet and dislocation. Some Dacian nobles negotiated terms that preserved lives and a measure of property in exchange for submission. Others fled toward communities beyond the frontier, carrying grievances and legends that would feed later memories of free Dacians. Garrison sites were cleared or reoccupied under new masters. The sanctuaries where councils had met were inventoried and, in places, damaged or dismantled, their role as centers of non-Roman authority deliberately broken. The workforce that had kept the strongholds and water systems functioning was sorted. Craftsmen identified for service under Roman oversight, laborers assigned to tasks that would now serve imperial roads, forts, and towns. One more consequence followed quickly from the capital's fall: the capture and dispersal of members of the royal household. Roman practice treated such persons both as hostages, ensuring the quiet of a conquered zone, and as living proof of the empire's reach. Their fate, while not always harsh in immediate terms, erased the possibility of a simple restoration of the old line. The political map was being redrawn not as a patchwork of client principalities but as territory destined for a province. The military map changed as well. With the capital taken and the king dead, remaining resistance flickered in pockets. Roman columns moved to secure mining zones and strategic crossings, to disarm strongholds that had not yet felt the full weight of the siege train, and to accept surrenders where defenders judged further effort pointless. Auxiliary cohorts swept valleys for caches of arms and for leaders suspected of organizing new bands. The pace of operations slowed from sieges and set-piece actions to a pattern of patrolling, garrisoning, and registering. What explains the sequence of Dacian defeat is not a collapse of courage. The garrisons fought under strain with skill and stubbornness. The sorties were real. The counterstrikes in Roman rear areas were often well-timed. The decisive elements were structural. The bridge turned the river into a permanent supply spine. The layered camps denied the capital the chance to shatter a single thin line and force a general retreat. The systematic search for and cutting of water feeds converted fortresses from nodes of resilience into traps of diminishing returns. When a state built on mobility and coordinated strongholds is compelled to hold one place under sustained pressure, the advantage tilts toward the power that can keep replacing its parts while the other watches its stores shrink. Rome's victory produced wealth as well as certainty. The treasure recovered from channels and caches funded public works and pay chests. The mines that had fed Dacian strength became imperial assets, their output to be organized under Roman administration. The hills that had once been guarded by a native levy would soon host legionary bases and veteran colonies. The shift from enemy country to Roman province did not occur in a single decree, but the steps began the day the capital fell. Conquest changed the map, but administration changed daily life. After the fall of Sarmizegetusa Regia and the death of Decebalus, Rome moved from campaigning to building a province. The work was deliberate. Military units pacified pockets of resistance while surveyors, jurists, and engineers translated imperial policy into streets, courts, tax rolls, and garrisons. The result was the province of Dacia, a new piece of Rome north of the Danube that would soon have its own capital, its own provincial law, and a military framework tied into the wider frontier system. The first choice was symbolic and practical at once, the site of the new provincial capital. Rome did not place it atop the sacred terraces of the conquered royal seat. Instead, planners selected a plain to the west of the old mountain core and founded a colony named Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa. The name joined imperial honor with local memory, yet the ground plan was Roman from its first chalk lines. A decumanus and a cardo crossed at right angles, a forum anchored civic life, a capital temple crowned the political hierarchy, and an amphitheater and baths announced the social rhythm of Roman towns. The decision to start fresh on lower ground sent a message. The rituals of the old Highland court would give way to municipal councils, magistrates, and written decrees posted on stone. Settlement followed policy. Veterans of the legions that had campaigned in the region received plots in and around the new colony. Civilian colonists arrived from many corners of the empire: Italians, people from the Danubian provinces, and families from the eastern and western Mediterranean, drawn by land, contracts, and the promise that a new province brings opportunities to those willing to take risks. The mix produced audible change. Latin speech crowded markets. Names carved on building dedications and tombstones showed a blend of origins, and guilds organized by craft and trade began to appear. None of this erased the local population. Instead, a layered society took shape. Veteran farmers and artisans, immigrant merchants and officials, and long-settled communities now drawn into the orbit of a Roman town. The provincial command structure took form next. A governor with senatorial rank headed the administration, responsible for civil order, legal cases of high value, and the coordination of military forces. Below him, a financial procurator managed revenues, especially those tied to the mines and state lands that had passed to imperial control. Municipal councils in towns large and small handled local duties, street repair, market regulation, and the upkeep of public buildings, under the watch of the governor's staff and visiting inspectors. Law moved from oral judgment in sanctuaries to written edicts pinned to boards in fora, where litigants could read deadlines and procedures and appeal as the statutes allowed. Rome bound the new province to the rest of the frontier by arranging a belt of legionary bases and auxiliary forts. The 13th Gemina settled as the main legionary presence in the heart of the province, its eagle a daily reminder of imperial power. The 4th Flavia Felix, stationed nearby at times or in linked theaters along the river, provided depth. Around these legions clustered auxiliary cohorts, archers, slingers, mounted units, and light infantry raised from across the empire and, in growing numbers, recruited locally. Their forts marked roads, river crossings, and passes. Watchtowers on heights and along riverbanks relayed signals, giving commanders a pulse of the countryside hour by hour. The fort system did more than deter raids. It anchored the road network that defined Roman Dacia. Engineers cut and paved lines that tied the new capital to the Danube crossings, to mining districts in the mountains, and to market towns that had existed in looser form before the conquest. Milestones logged progress. Mansions offered shelter and stables at measured intervals, and bridges turned winter torrents into reliable crossings. When a province can move troops in days and grain in weeks along dependable routes, it becomes governable in Roman terms. That was the point. Troops held the peace, roads made peace visible. Census and survey teams followed the soldiers and the road gangs. They measured fields, recorded owners, and clarified what counted as public land, what belonged to temple estates now converted to municipal property, and what remained in private hands. This work established the tax base. Dues could now be assessed in predictable amounts at predictable times, with a ledger to resolve disputes and prevent double demands. Communities with long memories of oaths sworn at hill sanctuaries learned to live under a calendar of dues set by provincial edict. In return, they saw garrisons keep roads safe on market days and found courts that heard cases on posted schedules. Religious life adjusted to the new regime. Temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva rose in towns and at legionary bases. The imperial cult found a home in the forum of the new capital, where officials swore loyalty at public ceremonies and dedicated altars that recorded the year and the magistrates in office. Local deities did not vanish. Shrines to mountain and spring spirits continued in village contexts, and some found a place alongside Roman gods in the way frontier provinces often did, through interpretatio that paired local powers with Roman names. Religion thus became a language of accommodation as much as rule, with processions and feast days that mixed conquered and conqueror. Courts and contracts now rested on Latin documents. Decrees traveled with seals. Receipts recorded deliveries in clear formulas, and manumission acts freed individuals in terms that could be read and cited. For people used to ritual oath and memory, this paper culture changed expectations. Disputes turned on texts rather than on testimony alone. Guilds adopted written rules, veteran colonies posted statutes that defined membership and dues, and building contracts set penalties for delays that a magistrate could enforce. This habit of writing is one of the quiet revolutions of provincial life. It did not make people more honest, but it made outcomes more predictable. A province cannot function without a stable food base. Roman officials therefore worked to secure grain supplies from the plains and valleys and to protect herding routes from the mountains to winter pastures. Markets along the Danube learned to coordinate with inland towns so that prices did not spike sharply in lean seasons. Rome did not aim to feed the province from outside. It aimed to keep internal flows reliable. When shortages did occur, the provincial granaries attached to legionary bases and major towns could cushion the blow. Trust grew when communities saw the state open stores in a bad year and recover the stock through modest levies in the next good one. Security policy balanced deterrence with integration. Rome offered auxiliary service to local men, turning potential opponents into soldiers with a stake in the new order. Service brought pay, equipment, and a path to citizenship for the soldier and his family at the end of the term. It also brought skills. Veterans returned to their villages knowing how to build and repair in Roman style, how to read basic posted orders, and how to use the road system efficiently. Over time, this flow of trained men thickened the fabric of provincial society, filling it with small competences that make Roman rule feel ordinary. Urbanization accelerated. Besides the new capital, older centers grew into municipalities with councils and magistrates. Street grids extended, forums acquired basilicas for legal proceedings and business. Bath complexes offered daily routines that mixed practical hygiene with social exchange. Inscriptions recorded generous acts by local elites, funding a portico, repairing a temple roof, underwriting games on festival days. Such benefactions were not only piety or vanity, they were the price of status in a Roman town. An elite that pays for streets and water earns respect and influence. A town that receives such gifts learns the etiquette of gratitude through plaques and decrees. The legal map changed under the Emperor Hadrian, who favored administrative clarity and realistic borders after his predecessor's expansions. He reviewed the shape of Dacia and refined it. The province, initially treated as a single unit under direct imperial attention, was reorganized into administrative zones that later sources remember as Upper and Lower Dacia and, in time, with further refinements. The purpose was not to diminish the province but to make supervision practical. A governor could not be everywhere. By dividing responsibilities, Rome ensured that appeals, tax collection, and troop deployments moved without bottlenecks. Hadrian also revisited the forward line of forts. He preferred a frontier that could be held without constant crisis. Some posts were shifted, some roads were strengthened. New watchtowers stitched gaps where raiders had found paths. The resulting frontier belts, later remembered by scholars as lines named for the regions they faced, protected the heartland while maintaining a forward presence where terrain and politics demanded it. The message to friends and foes alike was consistent. Rome would defend Dacia not with reckless sallies but with systems that made sudden incursions costly and dull. An important thread running through all these changes is the management of imperial assets. Mines that had once supplied the Dacian kings now answered to Roman procurators. Contracts went to entrepreneurs who could supply skilled labor and meet production quotas under inspection. Settlements sprang up around these districts with altars, taverns, and small offices where accounts were tallied and disputes mediated. Provincial law touched these communities constantly because money flowed there constantly. That flow attracted migrants from across the empire, further diversifying the social and linguistic landscape. Education, modest in scope but real in effect, followed the spread of written administration. Boys bound for clerical work learned enough Latin to copy and to count. Men in guilds learned to read basic regulations. Magistrates' staff practiced the formulas of edict and decree. The army served as a school as well, drilling not only in arms but in measurement, carpentry, and the Latin of orders. Over a few decades, the province that had once been administered entirely through interpreters began to speak the language of its rulers in markets and courts, at least on matters that required precision. The blend of peoples produced households that navigated multiple identities with ease. Names on tombstones combined indigenous elements with Roman tria nomina. Dedications paired local gods with Jupiter or Mars. And legal documents recorded marriages between settlers and locals whose families now shared property defined in Roman terms. This social knitting did not erase memories of the Old Kingdom. It translated them into a world where success required literacy in Roman law and comfort with Roman habits. Alongside these slow transformations came visible monuments that anchored pride. The new capital's forum displayed statues of emperors and inscriptions that placed Dacia in the same imperial story as far older provinces. Veterans paraded on festival days, guilds processed, provincial assemblies met to offer thanks and to voice petitions. The amphitheater drew crowds for spectacles that, whatever one thinks of them, satisfied a Roman taste for communal viewing and imperial largesse. Such spaces taught people how to be provincial Romans. By watching, participating, and learning the calendar of public life, military life did not vanish under the new order. It settled into routine. Patrols along the roads and across the hills enforced the peace. Drills kept standards high, and the presence of legions deterred large-scale incursions from neighbors who tested the border when they saw an opening. When disturbances did arise, they were handled locally first, then escalated as needed. The goal was to prevent any single incident from cascading into a crisis that might invite a general war. In that sense, the province functioned as intended, as a buffer made robust by towns, roads, and garrisons. The shift from royal centers to municipal life also reconfigured local elites. Families that had thrived by controlling sanctuaries and hill forts now sought office in councils and competed to sponsor civic improvements. Their authority no longer rested chiefly on command of levies. It depended on their ability to navigate provincial law, to win contracts, and to mediate between village needs and imperial demands. Some adapted quickly, others faded. Over a generation, the faces carved on honorific statues in town squares included the descendants of both groups, their identities recast in the idiom of civic virtue rather than hilltop prestige. No province is built without friction. There were confiscations and resettlements in the early years, and some communities felt the loss of autonomy keenly. Yet Rome's talent was to make the new order feel useful. Roads saved time, courts cut the cost of feuds, garrisons reduced the fear of sudden raids, and the provincial calendar regularized obligations so that households could plan sowing, harvest, and labor service. When a state keeps its promises often enough, resistance loses recruits. That was the quiet strategy behind the stone, to replace the memory of siege with the habit of schedule. A province becomes real when money moves easily, when roads hold in rain, and when contracts can be enforced beyond the village square. After conquest and the first wave of administration, Roman Dacia entered that phase. The imperial aim was simple and unsentimental: turn a mountainous land rich in ores, salt, timber, and pasture into a stable contributor to the imperial budget, while knitting it so tightly to neighboring provinces that revolt or isolation would feel costly to its own inhabitants. The tools were familiar: mines under imperial oversight, roads and bridges with regular way stations, municipally governed towns, and a legal culture that made paper promises bite. Auras came first because they underwrote everything else. In the gold country of the Apuseni Mountains, districts such as Alburnus Mayer and Ampelum were reorganized under imperial procurators who licensed claims, leased seams, and oversaw safety and taxation. The workforce was mixed. Veterans brought discipline, migrants from other mining regions brought technique, and local families provided labor and knowledge of the ground. The famous wax tablets from Alburnus Mayer, preserved by accident in abandoned galleries, reveal the texture of this world: debt acknowledgements, partnership agreements for exploiting veins, hiring contracts for timbering crews, house sales in mining hamlets, and surety bonds that pulled in neighbors as guarantors. The handwriting is uneven, the formulas precise. A miner who borrowed against a future share of ore did so under clauses that stated how disputes would be heard and how collateral would be seized if a deadline slipped. This paperwork was the frontier face of Roman law. It made strangers legible to each other. A Dalmatian carpenter, a Greek-speaking broker from the coast, and a Dacian miner could sit in a tavern by a shaft mouth and craft a document that a magistrate in a town miles away would recognize and enforce. The effect was to push decisions outward. People did not have to run back to the capital for every quarrel. They could solve it where they stood because the words they wrote bound them in the same way across the province. The mining districts required more than contracts. They needed wood, food, and water in quantities that could ruin a valley if handled carelessly. Rome, therefore, set quotas for timber cutting, directed the replanting of slopes near the busiest zones, and routed cart tracks to minimize erosion. Water channels were measured and shared according to posted timetables, with penalties for crews that stole flow during another team's allotted hours. Ore moving out met taxes at predictable gates, and bullion moving down met escorts at declared danger periods. Salt from springs and mines in the central hills moved along similar lines, guarded because the state knew that salt loosens the grip of scarcity in winter and makes garrisons calm. Roads turned these resource flows into reliable revenue. Surveyors laid out trunk lines from the new capital at Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa toward the Danube crossings, toward the ore zones of the mountains, and toward the northern frontier towns that anchored the limes. Milestones counted progress and stamped imperial names into memory. Along the routes, mansiones and mutationes offered stabling, repairs, and warm meals to officials and, by custom and bribery, to well-connected civilians. Bridgework that had begun as wartime necessity settled into peacetime routine. Crews patched decks, replaced timbers, and cleared silt from footings as a matter of schedule rather than crisis. When a wagoner could predict how long a run would take in spring rain, he priced his cargo accurately and showed up again next month. Towns rose where roads met and where garrisons spent pay. Apollum, near an important legionary base, grew into a two-part city with a civilian center and a military quarter that shared markets and artisans. Napoca, Potaissa, and Porolissum matured along the northern frontier. Drobeta prospered at the river crossing near the Great Bridge. Ampelum became the administrative heart of the mining zone. Each town developed a personality through the tastes of its benefactors and the specialties of its craftsmen. Brick stamps from local kilns mark the spread of construction. Amphory fragments testify to wine hauled from the Aegean and from the Danube's south bank. Lamps and tableware, record fashions that arrived with merchants and soldiers who had seen the same designs in distant provinces. Municipal life pulled local elites into a new competition. Wealth once displayed in hilltop feasts now bought honorific statues, porticos, bath repairs, and festival games. City councils published decrees thanking donors. Magistrates posted accounts so that a baker in the market could see how much a new fountain had cost and who had paid. This performative accounting disciplined ambition. A man who wanted prestige had to fund something useful, and the plaque that recorded his gift made promises public for generations. Over time, such habits created a civic culture that prized visible contributions and frowned on empty boasts. The army's pay chests were the province's second treasury. Soldiers spent on boots, cloaks, repairs, meat, and drink. Veterans bought plots and tools. The 13th Gemina, with its long residence, sustained a web of suppliers from leatherworkers to millers. Auxiliary cohorts redistributed money along the lines they patrolled, enriching small markets at river crossings and hill passes. The military also standardized demands for quality. A contractor who learned to deliver planks cut to the fort's preferred measurements could sell to the next fort with minimal haggling. That expectation, pieces that fit and weights that match, spilled into civilian trade. Agriculture adjusted to serve this mixed economy. Grain production expanded in river valleys and on the lowest soils of the western plains, not as vast estates only, but through a mix of veteran farms, tenant plots, and older village lands now secured by clear titles. Herding routes to winter pastures were marked on schedules that avoided garrison drills and market days, reducing friction. The state insisted on buffer stores in market towns, and legions kept emergency reserves, creating a safety net that smoothed prices after bad weather. Peasants noticed. When the state opens a granary on a lean winter market day, loyalty acquires a practical edge. Trade reached beyond the province in both directions. Outbound moved metals, hides, timber, salt, and cured meats. Inbound came wine, oil, fine pottery, tools, and occasional luxuries. Customs posts at provincial borders took their cut through Portoria, but posted rates and written receipts prevented arbitrary seizures. Caravans could plan margins, and the state could plan revenue. Inns along trunk roads became schools of empire in miniature. A merchant from the Adriatic might share a table with a veteran from Britannia and a miner from the Apuseni, all complaining about tolls and praising a recently paved stretch that saved an axle. Hadrian's administrative refinements strengthened this economy by subdividing responsibilities. By splitting Dacia into administrative regions with their own capitals and staffs, he shortened the distance between town hall and governor, and between governor and the imperial court. Appeals moved faster. Tax disputes could be settled before a harvest cycle had turned into a feud. And troops requested for a flare-up on one frontier did not leave a distant district uncovered for a whole season. The emperor's general preference for defensible, measured borders also guided road and fort maintenance. Posts that cost more to hold than they were worth were shifted. Watchtowers filled gaps that raiders had learned to exploit, and the rhythm of patrols adapted to the geography of ravines and open steppe. Markets in the northwestern belt reveal another dimension of rewiring. Frontier towns such as Porolissum became bridges between provincial order and the mixed world beyond the limes. On market days, traders and herders from outside the province entered with temporary passes, sold their goods under the eye of customs officers, and left with Roman coin and Roman prices fresh in their heads. This exchange enriched border communities, spread Roman weights and measures, and created constituencies beyond the province who had reasons to prefer a quiet frontier. Language followed the money. Latin became the currency of contracts, court pleas, and guild rules. Names on inscriptions show new layers. Indigenous names sit beside Roman trianomina. Dedications blend local deities with Jupiter, Hercules, or Diana. Funerary stones record careers that mixed military service, mining partnerships, and municipal office. This was not homogenization by decree, but standardization by utility. People adopted what worked. A craftsman who could sign a receipt in Latin and read a posted regulation avoided fines. A family that learned to phrase a petition to the governor gained speed in a property dispute. Over time, such incentives created a bilingual comfort that made the province legible to itself. Religion helped bind this civic world. The imperial cult offered occasions for public pledges and for communal meals in which officials, soldiers, guilds, and villagers stood together under banners that named the emperor and the province. Traditional practices persisted. Springs and groves did not lose their magnetism, but processions and sacrifices in town squares trained people to see themselves as part of a wider order. The two strands often intertwined. Altars to local mountain powers stood near temples of the Capitoline Triad. Soldiers left votives to eastern gods brought with them. Miners saluted patron deities who had followed their craft across provinces. Security policy kept prosperity possible. The frontier was not a wall, but a belt of observation and response. Patrols along the northern and eastern lines watched for Carpi and Sarmatian movements. Signal stations relayed beacons. Reserve cohorts stood where roads converged so they could move either way on short notice. Inside the province, garrisons protected miners' convoys on posted days and escorted tax shipments under seal. Rome did not seek to militarize every valley. It sought to make predatory raids unprofitable and dull. As long as most years were quiet, towns could grow without fortifying every street. The economic map shows how thoroughly the province integrated itself. Tile stamps carry the names of workshops tied to military contracts. Quarry marks identify teams whose stone went to bathhouses and bridges. Amphora stamps track wine routes from the Aegean and oil from the Western Mediterranean. In the mining towns, loan rates recorded on tablets shift with harvest cycles and ore output, a sign that information moved quickly along roads and across markets. Officials did not need to read every contract. They needed to keep the scaffolding intact, roads repaired, courts open, garrisons fed, taxes predictable. The rest followed. Not all effects were rosy. Deforestation near mining districts strained slopes. Inflows of migrants changed the balance in some villages. And the tax system, even when regular, pressed hard during poor harvests. Rome mitigated but did not erase such frictions. The provincial machine worked because, for most people most years, the benefits outweighed the burdens. Safer travel, clearer courts, steadier markets, and the chance to sell labor or goods beyond the next valley. Prosperity made Roman Dacia visible, and visibility drew pressure. In the later 2nd century of the Common Era, raiders and migrants along the long Danubian frontier began to test the province that Rome had wired for revenue. The state answered with fortified belts, mobile columns, and diplomacy that tried to make neighbors into buffers. At the same time, communities outside the province who shared language and customs with the conquered highlands persisted. Later writers would call them the free Dacians. The result was a frontier that demanded constant attention, not because the system had failed, but because it attracted more ambition than quiet could absorb. The northern and eastern approaches felt the weight first. Sarmatian groups on the plains, most notably the Iazyges and the Roxolani, valued speed and shock. Their long lances and armored riders could crash into thin lines, vanish into grass seas, and return where the ground suited them. Carpi communities along the eastern arc, settled in forest and hill, learned to move in disciplined bands that could skirt forts and strike at markets. Farther east, Gothic groups linked to the Black Sea routes entered the story as traders, mercenaries, and, at times, as raiders. None of these peoples formed a single, permanent coalition, but their combined pressure altered the mathematics of defense. Rome's first answer was to thicken the frontier. Watchtowers and small forts rose in a staggered pattern along ridgelines and river mouths, especially in the northwestern zone later known to scholars as the Porolissum Line. A complementary belt pushed east of the Olt created a forward screen that modern writers call the Transaleutan Line. These were not stone walls from sea to sea. They were chains of eyes and tripwires, earthworks, ditches, palisades, and blockhouses connected by patrol rhythms and signal beacons. Behind them, larger forts anchored the roads that converged on the new provincial capital and on the legionary base at Apollum. The design assumed that small posts would detect and delay, while mobile cohorts converged to hit raiders before they reached granaries and workshops. The second answer was movement. Legionary detachments and auxiliaries drilled to form flying columns that could march quickly, fight briefly, and return to base without exhausting men or mounts. This doctrine fit the geography of Dacia, where ravines, low mountain passes, and river corridors offered ambush points as well as pursuit lanes. A patrol might shadow a band for days, marking paths for the relief force that would do the striking. Commanders learned to let raiders commit to a laden return before springing the trap, turning wagons of stolen goods into anchors that kept enemies in reach. Councils in Rome watched the same frontier through a broader lens. The later years of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius brought the long Marcomannic conflicts, which stretched imperial attention across the Danube from the Alps to the Black Sea. Dacia was one theater among many, and it absorbed the lessons that came from this wider strain. The province's garrisons learned to cooperate with Pannonian and Moesian commanders to exchange scouts and to coordinate crossings so that a blow in one sector opened space in another. The principle was simple. A raid should never find only local defenders. It should feel the weight of a system. Disease complicated this picture. The great epidemic that swept the empire in the reign of Marcus Aurelius reduced manpower and frayed logistics from the Danube to the Nile. In Dacia, the effect was felt as thinner garrisons, delayed convoy escorts, and markets that took longer to recover from panic. Yet the institutions built in the province, regular store audits, written delivery contracts, and road schedules, helped it ride out the shock better than a looser frontier might have done. When a state can prove it will open granaries in a lean season and backfill with predictable levies later, households hold their nerve. Pressure did not abate with the passing of one emperor. The next generations faced a churn of leaders and priorities in the wider empire, the kind of political weather that always tempts border peoples to probe. Carpi bands, sometimes allied with Sarmatian riders, learned the intervals between patrols and targeted the moments when command changed hands. Gothic groups along the coast grew bolder in attacking shipping and in raiding deep into the Balkans. One celebrated shock, the Costoboci raid, ripped through parts of the Balkans and reached Greek lands, reminding Rome that disturbance in the Carpathian Arc could ripple far beyond Dacia's local map. Inside the province, these strains translated into a different kind of daily life. Town councils allocated extra funds for walls and gates. Craftsmen in frontier towns repaired more spearheads and fewer bath tiles. Landowners built granaries with stronger doors and hired more guards for harvest days. Military pay still drove markets, but supply lists tilted toward items a fort needs in a hurry. Spare mantlets for gate mouths, timber cut to standard for tower repairs, and iron fastenings sized for ladders and hinges. Mines continued to operate, yet convoys now moved under stricter schedules and heavier escorts, especially in the months when snowmelt made the rivers unpredictable and patrols harder to coordinate. Diplomacy accompanied hardware. Governors negotiated with Sarmatian lords, promising trade privileges and money for peace periods, while demanding hostages as guarantees. Some riders entered Roman service as auxiliaries, their loyalty pinned to paydays and to the prestige of imperial kit. Others remained independent and sold their speed to the highest bidder in any given season. The imperial aim was to channel ambition into contracts and to split dangerous combinations before they formed. It did not always succeed, but even partial success bought time for roads to be repaired and for cohorts to arrive. The story beyond the forts and roads involved the communities that Roman writers would call free Dacians. They lived outside the provincial boundary, but within the cultural field shaped by earlier kings and by long contact with Rome. Burial practices, house forms, and pottery styles in zones north and east of the province show a mix of continuity and adaptation. Local traditions persist, but imported goods and copied designs appear in growing numbers. These communities traded into the province at markets like Porolissum, hired on as guides or laborers, and sometimes joined raids when grievance or opportunity beckoned. They could be allies, neutral neighbors, or sharp adversaries depending on season and leadership. For Roman governors, the challenge was to keep these groups closer to the market than to the warpath. The border in this period thus functioned less as a line than as a membrane. Goods, people, and ideas crossed in both directions. Latin words for weights and measures slipped into the speech of traders beyond the limes. Local innovations in dress and gear appeared in provincial towns. Military practices leaked outward when veterans settled in mixed villages. This exchange helped peace in good years, because people with a stake in shared trade avoid wrecking the rules they profit from. In bad years, it also made raids more effective, because raiders knew where storehouses stood and which festivals drew garrisons off routine. Over time, the Roman answer to this fluidity shifted from hoping to seal the border to managing the space on both sides. Forward markets were kept open under watch, passes were cleared of brush to deny cover near the roads, and local auxiliaries were recruited from communities that had reasons to fight their neighbors. The goal was not to Romanize the entire frontier beyond the line, but to create layers of cooperation that dulled threats and multiplied warnings. A raid that surprised a fort was treated as an administrative failure as much as a tactical one. The wider empire added fresh complications in the 3rd century. Political succession wobbled, coinage lost weight, and campaigns elsewhere drew units away at the least convenient times. Dacia, with its mines and its proud place in imperial rhetoric, tried to hold standard under these conditions. Governors who knew the ground imposed predictable routines even during imperial turbulence. Patrols maintained their rhythm, courts met on posted days, tax collectors accepted grain when coin ran short, then converted it to cash when markets steadied. The habit of schedule became a defense in its own right. Still, strain told. Carpi raids grew more frequent and more ambitious, sometimes crossing the provincial boundary in multiple columns to test response. Sarmatian lords sensed opportunity when a governor was replaced or when snowmelt delayed relief. In some episodes, Gothic groups coordinated riverine moves with inland strikes, dividing attention. Towns rebuilt walls in stronger forms, rural shrines added watch platforms, and villagers learned to read the sky not only for weather but for smoke on the horizon. The military map adjusted. Some forward stretches of the Translutant Belt proved too costly to hold year after year. Posts were consolidated, resources were pulled back to lines that could be defended in depth. This was not abandonment of the province. It was a recalibration meant to save units for the fights that mattered. In practice, it meant longer rides for patrols and more reliance on allied scouts beyond the immediate frontier. A governor who knew his business made sure that these changes were explained to town councils so that rumor did not translate economy into panic. Throughout, the presence of free Dacians mattered in ways both subtle and direct. When aligned with Roman interests, they formed buffers and provided early warning. When aggrieved or tempted, they opened new paths for raiders who understood the old Dacian roads better than any surveyor. Their very existence reminded everyone that identity and province were not identical. A Dacian could be a Roman soldier from the Apuseni, a miner under imperial contract, a trader at Porolissum, or a farmer north of the limes listening for news from two worlds. This spectrum of roles helped prevent a clean break between province and hinterland, but it also made it harder to draw a clean plan for defense. Economic life bent under the weight, but did not snap. Mines delivered less in bad seasons and more in recoveries. Farmers switched acreage between cereals and fodder to match convoy schedules. Merchants hedged with mixed cargoes that could be sold to soldiers or to villagers depending on the week. The state contributed predictability, posted customs rates, standing contracts for timber and leather, and escorts on declared danger days. These small assurances kept long-distance traders from abandoning the routes that tied Dacia to the Danube's south bank and to the Pannonian road net. In the later 3rd century, the frontier storm thickened. New confederations formed beyond the river. Roman political crises multiplied, and commanders in neighboring provinces weighed their own survival as heavily as the safety of Dacia. The logic of layered defense still worked, but it required reinforcements that the wider empire did not always deliver on time. The balance between holding strategic forward lines and protecting the province's core became harder to maintain. Some districts recovered well after a raid, others struggled to replace men and stock quickly enough to meet the next levy. Amid this wear and tear, a hard question moved from whisper to policy. Could the empire continue to hold the province north of the Danube at reasonable cost, or should it trade space for stability by repositioning south of the river and carrying the Dacian name with it in administrative form? The very suggestion reveals how far the frontier had shifted since the time of Trajan. The province had been founded as a declaration of reach. It was now being measured as a problem of endurance. The story of Roman Dacia turns on a hard decision made under pressure. In the later 3rd century of the Common Era, the Emperor Aurelian faced a frontier that could no longer be held at acceptable cost. Raids multiplied, imperial politics convulsed, and legions were needed in too many places at once. Rather than bleed a proud but overexposed province, Aurelian chose a strategic retreat to the south bank of the Danube, carrying the name of Dacia with him. That move did not erase the human landscape north of the river, but it did redraw the administrative map and signaled a new philosophy of survival. The background was an empire under strain. The long crisis of the 3rd century had shaken confidence in borders that earlier emperors had treated as permanent. Breakaway regimes in the west and in the east carved territories from Rome's body. Coinage lost weight, and frontier commanders made decisions with one eye on their enemies and the other on the next political whirl in the capital. Along the lower Danube and around the Carpathian Arc, the Carpi mounted repeated incursions. Sarmatian riders probed, and Gothic coalitions learned to coordinate strikes by land and by river. Dacia, rich in mines and towns, attracted attention it could no longer deflect with routine measures. Aurelian was a soldier first. He had already shown a preference for realistic lines when he refocused Western defenses after retaking provinces that had slipped away. On the Danube, he judged that a province north of the river, for all its value, had become a trap that forced Rome to fight on ground chosen by others. He resolved to move the imperial line to where roads and supply were easier to protect and where river fleets could support forts without precarious crossings. The plan was to withdraw legions and selected civilians from Dacia north of the Danube, and to establish a new administrative Dacia on the safer southern bank. The withdrawal was not a single march but a sequence of controlled movements. Commanders first concentrated troops from scattered posts into defensible corridors that led to major crossings. Supply stores that could be moved were bundled into convoys. What could not be removed, bridge timbers at exposed fords, sections of frontier earthworks, surplus timber in forward towers, was spiked, burned, or dismantled to deny easy use to pursuers. Rear guards covered each stage, falling back to the next prepared position in a rhythm learned from years of campaign craft. Aurelian's officers had no intention of turning an orderly retreat into a rout. Civilians faced choices and the state tried to shape them. Aurelian offered structured resettlement to communities whose livelihoods could be transplanted, craftsmen tied to legionary contracts, families from mine districts whose skill could be applied in the mountains south of the river, merchants who served the army and understood the road network. These people were promised land, tax relief for a settling period, and the protection of fort belts that the emperor intended to strengthen. Not everyone left. Many villagers north of the river weighed their chances and stayed, trusting to old ties with neighbors, to speed in flight when needed, or to the hope that new masters would be no harsher than the old tax collectors. The province would dissolve, but the countryside would endure in diverse ways. On the south bank, Aurelian rebuilt in his own image. He created a new Dacia, often called Dacia Aureliana, as a formal province situated in the safer Danubian hinterland. The legal continuity soothed pride and eased administration. Officials could say that Dacia lived, even if the map had shifted. The new province inherited the task of guarding key crossings and of anchoring the line with towns that could supply and shelter troops. A generation later, imperial reformers refined this arrangement by dividing the southern Dacia into two complementary provinces, one oriented toward the river with a military character, remembered as Riparian Dacia, and one inland with a more civilian profile, remembered as Mediterranean Dacia. That later subdivision followed the same logic Aurelian had applied: align administration with function so that governors and generals know where their responsibilities begin and end. Fortification policy shows the continuity behind the change. A chain of legionary bases and auxiliary forts south of the Danube received upgrades, ramparts raised, ditches recut, granaries rebuilt with better fire breaks, and river landings graded for quick embarkation. Watchtowers sprouted on heights that commanded crossing points, and signal lines were rehearsed so that a beacon in one valley drew a timed response in the next. Fleet cooperation deepened, patrol craft learned the river's winter moods, and practiced ferrying detachments on short notice to reinforce a threatened bend. The line was not a wall, it was a living belt that gave Rome the advantage of interior movement. The administrative shift carried economic consequences. Mines north of the river slipped from imperial control or continued under new local arrangements. Rome compensated by tightening its grip on resources south of the river and by redirecting trade routes to towns now designated as hubs. Contracts for timber, leather, and grain were rebased in riverine markets where escorts could be guaranteed. Coin reforms associated with Aurelian slowly steadied pay chests, and the relocation of veteran settlers created new demand for tools, bricks, and livestock in places that had once served merely as way stations. In effect, the state transplanted the economic heart of the frontier to ground where the pump could be protected. Law followed the people. Settlers who moved under imperial protection carried their documents with them: property deeds, partnership contracts, discharge papers from the legions. Provincial clerks recognized these records and translated them into the new jurisdiction, assigning plots, confirming guild memberships, and enrolling families into the local tax rolls with allowances that eased the first seasons. This legal transfer mattered because it signaled that the empire did not see the evacuees as refugees drifting in search of mercy, but as citizens and subjects whose rights and obligations continued without a break. Culturally, the transplant created interesting blends. Veterans from towns like Apollum or Napoca who resettled south of the river brought household gods, market habits, and a Latin that carried the cadence of Old Dacia. They married into communities already on the Danubian plain, shared crafts, and formed guilds that bore familiar names. Inscriptions from the southern provinces begin to show clusters of names that echo the northern mix, and dedications reveal memories of northern sanctuaries repurposed in new shrines. The imperial cult remained the public face of loyalty, but private religion and family practice kept older threads alive. Identity became a layered thing. A person could be a citizen of a town in the new Dacia, a veteran of a legion once stationed beyond the river, and a bearer of customs learned in highland villages that were now stories shared at winter feasts. North of the Danube, life did not resolve into a single tale. Some towns withered as garrisons withdrew and markets shifted. Others found new roles as nodes in networks controlled by Carpi leaders or Gothic captains. Communities that Roman writers labeled as free Dacians continued to live in familiar valleys, trading across the river when politics allowed and sheltering behind local alliances when danger heightened. Pottery styles, house forms, and burial customs in these zones suggest continuity with adaptation, a world learning to live without the regular schedules of Roman taxation and justice, but not without memory of them. Aurelian's policy had a military purpose beyond the immediate relief of a stretched frontier. By consolidating forces south of the river, he created a reserve that could be sent rapidly against threats that mattered most in any given season. He restored the empire's ability to choose its fights. The North Bank had tied down troops in a defensive posture that encouraged enemies to dictate tempo. The South Bank allowed counterstroke. When raids came, patrols shadowed them. When crossings were tested, rivercraft delivered men to flank the attackers. When a larger coalition formed, legions could march along roads that stayed within the empire's protective belt. The cost was a wound to pride and the loss of mines that had once filled imperial coffers. The gain was elasticity. There were human costs that no decree could soften. Families were split when some chose to leave and others to stay. Burial grounds were abandoned or revisited only furtively. Crafts tied to specific mountain resources could not always be transplanted. Yet the state's willingness to carry people, to recognize their paperwork, and to seat them at the heart of a reconfigured frontier preserved more than it lost. The new Dacia was not a ghost province. It was a working shield with towns that learned to speak with the same civic confidence the northern municipalities had once displayed. In the short term, the withdrawal stabilized the line. In the longer term, it influenced how future generations would remember the region. Roman authors, writing with the telegraphy of triumph and prudence, presented Aurelian as the emperor who saved the state by refusing to fight yesterday's war on yesterday's ground. Later chroniclers, looking back through the haze of changing politics and migrations, used the creation of the southern Dacia as a hinge chapter in the history of the Danube. The name endured in law, on milestones, and in the mouths of settlers whose children learned their Latin prayers on a different bank. The decision also reframed relationships with peoples beyond the river. Diplomacy had to be rebuilt around trade and hostages rather than around the presence of legions in their old posts. Some Carpi groups were settled within the empire under terms that transformed potential enemies into taxpayers and auxiliary recruits. Gothic leaders learned that the empire would bargain, strike, and invite, but would not extend itself into traps. The frontier became less a series of small walls and more a system of moving parts backed by a river that Rome again used as an ally. Aurelian's choice is best understood as a lesson in imperial triage. He accepted that not all gains are permanent and that some borders make bad masters. By preserving the name of Dacia in a safer shape, he kept pride aligned with prudence. By tending to the legal and economic needs of those who followed the legions south, he turned a retreat into a relocation. And by strengthening fort belts and fleet cooperation, he made the Danube do what rivers do for organized states: feed, carry, and defend. Long after spears were stacked and forts went quiet, the Dacians lived on in stone, ink, and story. The last act of their political history gave way to the first act of their remembrance. What people thought about Dacia, its kings, its wars, its culture, was shaped not only by what happened but by what artists carved, what chroniclers copied, and what later generations wanted to find when they looked backward. This section follows that afterlife. The Roman monuments that fixed an image of Dacians in marble and bronze, the ancient books that arranged facts and legends, the medieval and early modern echoes that complicated the past, and the modern scholarship and archaeology that sifted memory with spade and method. The most famous monument of all is the column Trajan raised in the Capitol at Rome. Its spiral reliefs do not merely decorate, they narrate. Marching scenes, bridge building, river crossings, diplomacy, sieges, and the final hunt for a fleeing king unroll in a continuous ribbon. Dacians appear as worthy foes, bearded, long-haired, in trousers and cloaks, sometimes armored, often poised with that distinctive curved blade. Captives do not grovel, they stand dignified, guarded rather than crushed. Roman ideology is clear, imperial order triumphs. Yet the visual language respects the enemy's skill. That choice mattered. For Roman viewers, the Dacians became the frontier's archetypal opponent, formidable, organized, and ultimately conquered. For later viewers, the reliefs preserved a wealth of detail about costume, equipment, and tactics that would otherwise be lost. Other Roman monuments added their voices. At the great trophy site on a bluff above the lower Danube, a victory monument celebrated the suppression of frontier enemies with a ring of carved metopes showing battles, pursuits, and punishments. There, too, the Dacian figure took shape in Roman eyes, paired with other peoples in a program that announced the river's pacification. Coinage reinforced the message. Types bearing legends of victory over Dacia circulated widely, carrying into daily exchange the image of a defeated but memorable foe. Public art thus made the Dacian Wars a shared reference point for people far from the Danube, a set of images one could recognize even without reading. Texts gave the images a frame. Roman historians and antiquarians, such as Cassius Dio, Pliny, and others, wrote about the Dacians within broader narratives of imperial expansion, frontier management, and the character of neighboring peoples. Their purposes were not the same as modern historians' aims. They wrote to explain triumphs and disasters, to advise rulers, to moralize about fortune and discipline. In doing so, they preserved names, episodes, and judgments that scholars still mine for detail. Greek authors who had long described the Getae and their beliefs set a deeper backdrop. They connected Danubian peoples to questions of justice, piety, and immortality, sometimes idealizing, sometimes simplifying, always making a distant frontier legible to Mediterranean eyes. The later Roman world added a different filter. As Gothic groups pressed into imperial narratives, some writers played with old labels, treating Getae and Goths as interchangeable or related. The historian Jordanes, compiling a Gothic story from earlier works, mapped Gothic claims onto a geography and vocabulary once used for the Getae. That choice did more than confuse terms. It layered identities, so that in certain medieval readings, the fame and ferocity once ascribed to Danubian Thracians slid toward people moving under a Gothic name. Memory bled along linguistic seams. Medieval scholars working in Latin and in Byzantine Greek preserved brief notices of Dacia's wars and monuments, but interest often centered on saints, emperors, and theological quarrels. The Danube frontier became a horizon rather than a focus. Still, ruins and old road lines drew attention. Travelers saw broken stones near the river and speculated about earlier strength. Monastic libraries copied late antique summaries in which the story of Trajan's northern campaigns stood as one paragraph among many about imperial deeds. Early modern antiquaries, stirred by curiosity about Rome's reach, began to look more closely. Inscriptions were catalogued, ruins were sketched, coins were collected and compared. The new science of epigraphy recovered the names of legionary units stationed in Dacia, the municipal offices of towns, and the dedications of local elites who funded civic buildings in provincial Latin. Mapmakers, folding field observations into classical references, drew provincial boundaries with increasing care. The Dacian past gained sharper outlines not because a single book told the whole tale, but because small texts on stone and bronze, read together, filled gaps that narrative histories had left empty. As national ideas took shape in modern Europe, Dacia's story acquired another role, a resource for identity. The question of continuity, whether and how communities north of the Danube carried on in the centuries between Roman withdrawal and medieval polities, became a matter not only of scholarship but also of pride and politics. One line of thought emphasized survival and fusion. That people formed in the furnace of Roman rule remained, mixing with newcomers but maintaining language and custom in a way that stretched across eras. Another line stressed migration and replacement, that later arrivals shaped language and identity most strongly, with Roman traces persisting but not dominating. Both positions sought ancestors in the Dacian and provincial experience. Both read the same stones and sites differently. Archaeology entered this debate with tools more powerful than rhetoric. Systematic excavation at highland fortresses, market towns, and the two great Sarmizegetusas, the old mountain seat and the Roman colony on the plain, produced layers, catalogs, and dates that helped organize the long-after story. At the mountain capital, archaeologists traced terraced platforms, water channels, and sanctuaries whose plans matched the discipline described by earlier writers. In the Roman colony, a grid of streets and its forum complex made visible the civic order that replaced the old royal court. Finds from mining districts preserved contracts on wax tablets, showing in ordinary detail how partnerships and debts were formed and settled. Burial grounds traced change in costume, ornament, and ritual over generations. Each trench and survey carved away at romantic images and replaced them with patterns. This modern work also rebalanced the narrative of power and daily life. The monumental story, the bridge, the sieges, the triumphal reliefs, remained important, but it no longer stood alone. Household pottery, loom weights, iron clamps from fortress gates, and repair notes on scrap tablets told a quieter truth about habit and resilience. Scholars could trace how techniques traveled along roads, how trade linked valley and coast, how river patrols changed market rhythms. They could also chart how, after the imperial withdrawal, communities in the hills and plains adapted, some by forming new alliances, some by continuing old crafts under new masters, some by moving in step with frontier politics. The signature of the Dacian world survived not only in names and myths, but in the ways people built, stored, and mended. Art history added still another angle by following the Dacian figure through Roman sculpture and later revivals. Statues of Dacian captives, carved to stand on the ledges of imperial forums, wear patterned pants and heavy cloaks, their faces grave rather than crushed. Renaissance and Baroque artists, fascinated by classical ruins, copied these heads and draperies, sometimes refitting them as generic barbarians, sometimes naming them explicitly as Dacians. In this way, the visual type, long hair, beard, wrapped cloak, left the river's history and entered a larger European vocabulary of the noble enemy. The image floated free from its origin, influencing how people pictured antiquity's others, even when they could not place Dacia on a map. Modern museums and textbooks tightened the bond between artifact and narrative. Exhibitions brought together the columns' casts, fortress fittings, coins, and tablets, inviting visitors to connect the monumental scenes with the everyday objects that made those scenes possible. University courses meshed ancient texts with archaeological reports, teaching students to weigh a sentence from a Roman historian against a layer of ash in a hill fort, or a change in pottery temper. Digital projects mapped roads and fort belts, letting scholars test hypotheses about movement and supply against a reconstructed landscape. The Dacian past became a case study in how to integrate sources rather than a tale lifted from a single sculpture or chronicle. Language, too, carries memory. The Latin of the province left fingerprints in the speech of later centuries south and north of the Danube, in place names, in loanwords for tools and measures, and in the structure of liturgical Latin that persisted in ecclesiastical contexts. These traces do not settle big debates by themselves, but they remind us that administration and daily exchange leave marks where armies once stood. The sound of a word can carry a schedule, a tax, a craft, or a custom across generations. In public culture, the Dacian legacy appears whenever monuments, school lessons, and tourist routes meet. National narratives use the Dacian story to argue for deep roots, for cultural blending, or for the costs and benefits of empire. Popular retellings often borrow the dignity from Trajan's images and the heroism from resistance tales, shaping a past fit for modern hopes. Responsible history does not scold this desire. It asks for balance, for sources, and for the courage to hold complexity. The Dacian world was never a single tribe with a single fate. It was a region of linked communities, religious and legal innovations, mountain fortresses and river markets, royal courts and Roman councils. Its memory deserves that scale. Scholarly disagreements persist, as they should. How far did priestly authority reach in shaping early law? How exactly were mountain water systems laid out and defended? What proportion of the provincial population spoke Latin fluently, and in what contexts? Which communities beyond the limes maintained material continuity with the conquered heartland, and for how long? New digs, new dating methods, and new syntheses continue to refine answers. In this way, the Dacian story remains open not because the facts are slippery, but because the evidence grows and because historical questions sharpen with each generation. One enduring lesson from this afterlife is the power of infrastructure to shape memory. The bridge on the Danube, the roads in the hills, the terraces at the mountain capital, the forum of the Roman colony. These were not only instruments of rule, they were anchors for recall. When a traveler in late antiquity or the medieval centuries crossed a Roman-span river or walked along a still straight road, he met the ghost of decisions made long before. When a modern archaeologist lifts a clamp from a fallen gate beam or reads a miner's contract on a wax tablet, she hears the practical voice of a world often hidden behind marble reliefs. Memory, in short, clings to things built with care and used with discipline. Another lesson lies in the dignity of the defeated. Roman artists and authors could have mocked the Dacians. Instead, they often showed them as brave, organized, and serious. That choice strengthened the victor's credit, but it also preserved the vanquished as more than shadows. Later readers and viewers benefit from that nuance. It reminds us that the frontier's story is not a morality play about civilization and savagery, but a study in how neighboring systems compete, learn, and change each other. Finally, the Dacian image in history is a record of adaptation. The mountain kingdom adapted priestly law to politics. The Roman Empire adapted engineering to terrain. Border communities adapted trade to patrols. Post-Roman peoples adapted crafts and routes to new powers. Historians and citizens today adapt evidence to new questions. Each turn keeps the story alive. The Dacian world began as a set of valleys and hilltops, a river and a ring of fortresses. It endures as a conversation among stones, texts, and living communities who still walk the roads that empire once cut and still speak words that empire once spread. With that, the full arc closes. From scattered tribes to a sacredly ordered kingdom, from royal unity to imperial siege, from province to frontier memorial, and from memory to method. The Dacians remain present not as ghosts behind glass, but as partners in the long human project of building, believing, fighting, and then telling what it meant. Believing, fighting, and then telling what it meant.